an tábhair faoi cabbagil nó ráiteas maidir leis an dlí achóirí dúlra. Statements on nature restoration law. And Minister Noonan.
Margaret Lascan Corla agus Watnam Buigas Goal or on Deish con Kaint Fui on Lee or Cora Nadur. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in relation to the nature restoration law. Just to state, I'm sharing time with Minister Ryan, 15 and 5. So it's first of all, for me, it's very important as Minister of State for Nature to hear the views of deputies across the House and to have an opportunity to engage in constructive and honest debate in what I have no doubt will be a really transformative piece of legislation for Ireland. The NRL is indeed historic. It is the most powerful instrument for the protection and restoration of nature in 30 years. And it's no secret that biodiversity is in steep decline and nature needs our help. And I'm sure that none of us in this House will disagree on the science in relation to that. The nature restoration law presents a once-in-a-generation opportunity to arrest that decline and to reverse it. For people like me, environmentalists who have the luxury of putting their love of the natural world and all the species within it to the forefront of their minds, it is a beacon of hope. However, I am keenly aware that for many others, farmers, foresters, fishers in particular, whose livelihoods depend on the use of our lands and seas and who do not have the same luxury, the nature restoration law might be a cause for significant concern. And I want to say to those people that I am listening to them, that they will be engaged with, that their voices will be heard and their concerns will be addressed. I will get a copy and send it across.
I think members would like it.
Okay. Yeah. They're listening. I'm sure we'll get copies across now. But before I speak to my vision for the nature restoration law and the opportunities that it represents for those individuals, their communities and the wider rural economy, I would like to deal with some of the misinformation that has been at play in this debate. Because that's what it has been, misinformation, and dare I say it, in some cases, scaremongering. And in some other cases, in a deliberate attempt to whip up fear for what I can only assume is some narrow political gain. But I do acknowledge that there has been genuine concerns too. Polarised debates such as the ones we have had in this House, in the media, bring much heat but little in the way of light. I intend to use some of my time here today to shed light on the facts and, as I said at the outset, engage in a constructive and honest conversation. On Tuesday evening, I sat down with Minister McConalogue to discuss the nature restoration law, and we are united in our views, and I would like to set out these points on the record for the benefit of everybody here, and I want to be crystal clear on this. First of all nature restoration measures will be voluntary. There has been significant confusion around whether the NRL is mandatory or not. It's mandatory for Ireland. The legal obligation to achieve the targets is on the member state. It's Ireland who will be in court if we don't comply. But participation in restoration measures for individual landowners is voluntary. The legislation is explicit on this in relation to rewetting, but participation in relation to wider restoration measures is a national competency. The Government is clear that all restoration measures will be voluntary. It is up to the Government to make the participation an attractive proposition. Rewetting targets have been softened compared to the original draft of the NRL. What's more, Member States can determine for themselves what rewetting means in practice, and this includes at national, regional or sectoral levels. The Government is confident that the 2030 and 2040 rewetting targets, at a minimum, can be met entirely from state lands. That's worth repeating, that we are confident that the 2030 and 2040 targets can be met on state lands. More analysis is needed to establish how far we can go towards 2050 rewetting targets on public land. However, and this is really important, a further caveat allows Member States heavily affected by rewetting obligations to determine lower targets in certain circumstances. In terms of restoration measures and the cap payments, this was confirmed by Commissioner Savinkovas in a letter to Billy Kelleher this week, and I will confirm it again. The Commissioner said that the NRL neither interferes nor amends cap payment rules. Cap regulations, recital 16, are clear. The area eligible for direct payments is not reduced when subject to certain requirements relating to environmental protection and remains eligible for direct payments. Key in this confusion around the definition of condition, the condition of habitats and ecosystems is very different to agricultural condition. The former relates to ecological assessments as defined in the Habitats Directive, and the latter relates to good agricultural environment condition under the CAP regulations. And I can confirm that restoration measures will not negatively impact on any existing CAP payments or any other scheme or incentive delivered by DAFM. The Government is committed to ensuring that the nature restoration provides additional income streams for those who choose to participate. Schemes will be well incentivised and, crucially, designed in partnership with all stakeholders over the next 2 years as part of the nature restoration planning process. Farmers' expertise will be called upon to help shape these schemes. I want to thank the Féin family up in County Westmeath. I was there this morning. I have the muck on my heels to prove it, and the work they're doing on the Farming for Water EIP, where I was there with my colleagues, Minister McConlogue and Minister Hackett. There's fantastic work going on around the country. In terms of funding, the legislation commits the EU to an assessing the level of funding required to implement the NRL, and B, to conducting an overview of financial resources available. The Irish Government will support the Commission in these assessments. As you will be aware, we have already announced a €3.15 billion Climate and Nature Fund, and this fund will support the implementation of the NRL. The potential for private funding will also be explored. It's often missed in conversations on the NRL, but tens of thousands of Irish farmers are already volunteering to take part in nature restoration schemes. It's happening up and down the country, and I've met with many of the farmers who are involved in these schemes. 46,000 farmers are part of the Acres programme, and both Acres General and the cooperation projects. An additional 9,000 farmers were accepted onto this scheme today, and again I want to thank my colleague Minister McConlogue for fighting for this, and I think it's a really welcome development. Over 3,200 are participating in EIPs, and this number will increase significantly as 2 new large-scale EIPs for water and breeding waders, which I launched with Minister McConlogue and Minister Hackett, come on stream. Over 1,200 are already taking part in LIFE programmes, and over 300 are involved in the MPWS Farm Plan Scheme, again many of which I have visited over the last number of years, doing really wonderful work already in restoring nature. We will build on what works and improve it to give farmers the confidence to get involved. I do hope that deputies and anyone else who's listening today, that it will be clear from what I have said that farmers have nothing to fear from the nature restoration law. If anything, this law has the potential to bring substantial opportunities. By working together and listening to each other, we can ensure that implementation at farm level is harmonious and beneficial in the context of food production. Ultimately, food production and healthy nature depend on one another. Their fortunes in Ireland are entirely intertwined. Future generations of farmers, indeed future generations in Ireland as a whole, will have their livelihoods, their health and their well-being severely diminished if we carry on down the path we have been travelling. Change is urgently needed. But it is understandable that with change comes uncertainty. As Minister of State with responsibility for the Birds and Habitats Directives, I know all too well the history of nature conservation in Ireland and the challenges experienced by many farmers. I understand the fear of designations, the complex layer of bureaucracy they introduced in the day-to-day farming, and these challenges of working with the land and the seas in these contexts. I understand the fear of land being devalued. Because I understand those things, I am able to give you my firm commitment today that we have learned from the mistakes of the past. There are no designations under the NRL. The Director General of the MPWS, Niall Donoghue, confirmed this today in the Farmers' Journal. We will hear everyone's views. We will ensure that measures are workable at farm level, that they are supported by good guidance and advice, and that they bring real benefits for nature and for people. And let's be clear here. People want this, young people want it, the Irish public want it, and it's not just my voters, it's your voters too. Nature is something that motivates and inspires everyone, young, old, urban, rural, office workers, shop workers, farm workers. I've never met a single person who has told me they don't care about nature in some way or other. I believe that this is why the nature restoration law brought about by such an enormous groundswell of support from right across society. This has been reflected across government too. Ireland has been utterly consistent in its support for the NRL. Our coalition partners deserve significant credit for this, particularly Agriculture Minister Charlie McConlogue, who has truly led from the front. And our colleagues in Europe, our MEPs, particularly our Fine Gael MEPs, they were pivotal in bringing the nature restoration law to this point, and their decision to support it will long be remembered. I think we can say that without Ireland, without the leadership of the Irish Government and Irish MEPs, Europe would not have a nature restoration law. If this is not a powerful indication of just how seriously Ireland takes the biodiversity crisis, I don't know what is. It's baffling then that Sinn Féin, who voted in favour of the nature restoration law in the Dáil, who supported the NRL in previous Parliament vote, and who frequently say that they are committed to climate and biodiversity action, should backtrack so spectacularly. But I guess that's what they do. The Government is on the right side of history on this one, and our attention now turns to the development of our National Nature Restoration Plan over the next 24 months. It's up to each Member State to decide on how it will achieve its obligations under the NRL. These obligations are expansive, covering multiple policy areas and a wide array of habitats, species and ecosystems. Agricultural ecosystems with targets for farmland birds, grassland butterflies, high diversity landscape features, cropland mineral soils and, of course, rewetting of peat soils. Forest ecosystems with targets for increasing trends of standing and lying deadwood, uneven-aged forests, forest connectivity, forest birds, and a contribution to an EU-wide ambition to plant 3 billion trees by 2030. River ecosystems with targets for restoring natural floodplain functions and removing artificial barriers. Urban ecosystems where we will be increasing green spaces and tree canopy cover. Marine ecosystems with targets to restore habitats and achieve good environmental status. And restoration targets for all of the listed habitats and species under the EU nature directives, our most precious places for nature, across terrestrial, coastal and freshwater ecosystems throughout the state. It is indeed a huge and a daunting task. In my department, work has already started to develop Ireland's nature restoration planning process. Led by an independent chair, this process will comprise of a series of interactive workshops on 3 key themes: land, marine and urban environments. I'm clear this won't be an ordinary public consultation. It will be based on principles of participation and co-creation. I believe this approach, which puts people at the centre and values diverse perspectives, is vital if the NRL is to be a positive force for change. But we can't shy away from the fact that developing the plan will be an enormous challenge. 2 years is not long to do all of the work that's needed. We have to quantify and map areas to be restored, set the baseline from which progress can be measured, identify and develop measures and actions for inclusion in the plan, develop schemes and programmes to enhance delivery, outline timescales, monitoring requirements, financing needs, capture and represent the requirements of strategic partners and stakeholders, and then we have to implement it. I see the implementation of the Nature Restoration Law and Ireland's efforts to reverse years of nature loss as one of the most important national projects over coming decades. It's our Mehel Moor. Healthy nature is our first and best line of defence against climate change. The resilience that restored and natural ecosystems will bring will help us to withstand the worst effects of extreme weather, floods and droughts. And as our population grows, more of us will be looking for ways to get away from screens, disconnect from the digital world and out into the fresh air where we can get our hands dirty. Action for nature is good for us, for our physical health, for our peace of mind, for our overall well-being. It also gives us a sense of hope that the future is something we have the power to make, and not just less bad, but actively better. And while much of the debate has been focused on farmers, this really is about everybody. There is a role for all of us restoring nature. Ní neart go Carlow-Kilkenny, agus ní mór de gacht ine a bheith taobh hir den glúiseach seo. Tá nádúr ag fannachling, tá ar báistí ag brathniúing, agus tá an glúnta atá le teacht ag brath orine. Gur maigad.
Thank you very much indeed. I want to join my colleague, Minister Noonan, and welcome very much this historic decision to proceed with the nature restoration law in Europe, which I think is desperately needed because our natural systems are in absolute stress. They are under huge pressure. In the last 50 years, we've lost half of all wildlife in the natural world by invertebrate body mass weight. And that's not just the headline fauna, the kind of the animals that attract all the interest, but it's in the insect life, it's in the bird life, it's everywhere. It's right across our world that we've seen this destruction of the natural world, a natural world where the use of pesticides and fungicides, where pollution, where over-extraction, removal of nature is widespread and is destroying the fabric of our natural systems, our ecological systems upon which we depend. And we can all have examples of it. Of any of a certain age, you can notice the difference and can see it in reality happening in our own country. The personification of it for me was last summer. I was out on a kayak out in the west of Ireland, and I saw a pair of trawlers, 2 trawlers, follow the coast, hugging the coast, right inshore, with a ginormous net, scooping up every single minnow, every single sprat, every single bit of wildlife, natural systems. And for what? Probably to convert into fish food to feed to salmon in cages. And I watched the boat as the 2 trawlers as they went from near Runa around to Slinehead. You'll know the area, Las Cahorla. And someone said to me last week they saw the same thing down in West Cork, and they were crying at the tragedy of what's happening to our commons, to the natural systems. Also under threat, nature, because of climate change. We've got variety. We have 3 ecological crises unfolding at the one time: the loss of nature, the climate change caused by our actions, and the widespread pollution of our waterways, our airways, and our natural systems. The first point I would like to make is that in addressing climate change, we can also address the degradation of our natural world at the same time. And I believe specifically under this government, we have a real opportunity, because the mechanisms we're doing to address that, probably one of the most critical is the land use review, which we're engaged in, can feed in and support and complement and enhance the nature restoration law we now need to implement over the next 2 years, I think, isn't it, Minister Noonan? Correct. And the timelines are roughly similar. And that review of our land is not, going back to what Minister Noonan says, it's not telling an individual farmer or an individual forester this is what you have to do or else. It's trying to get an assessment of what's happening and trying to make sure we align our incentives with both rural development, farming future, but also protection of the natural world and system. And the scale of change is not small. We know we made a huge change in this country in going from only 2% forestry cover back at the start of the foundation of the state to some 11% today. No fault of anyone, or not putting the blame, but those forest systems were put in the wrong place, up high on the mountains typically, where we were draining peaty soils, but also the nature of the forestry, clear fell, monoculture, fast rotation cycles, is not enhancing nature, is not improving water quality, is not protecting and encouraging biodiversity. So that needs to change, and that's what Minister Pippa Hackett has started and initiated under the new forestry programme, which does start to put nature centre stage. And similarly in farming, and to echo what Minister Noonan has said, I see nothing but opportunity for this in the Irish farming community, because the current system does not serve, in my mind, the vast majority of farmers in terms of income, in terms of certainty for the future. I was really encouraged this morning reading the newspapers, and you see these signs every day of green shoots in our country. I think Minister McConnell has expanded again further the access to the Acres programme, which was massively oversubscribed beyond what anyone expected. There must be almost half of Irish farmers now are in the Acres system with the further extension today. And that's a sign, I think, that this false narrative, this kind of thing, environment versus agriculture, that's not the future. And I believe the vast majority of Irish farmers understand that as well, as can be seen by the likes of the engagement in the likes of the Acres programme. And similarly, managing our wetlands, our 3 major areas, forestry, pasture lands and wetlands, we're starting to change. Boardnamona, I would cite, is probably the best example of a country going from brown to green. There are 13,000 hectares, I think, of bogland that we've already rehabilitated. And when you go and visit that rehabilitation, it's fascinating to see how quickly nature comes back, how the management of that, using the same skills that we'd use to extract the peat, suddenly you start to notice nature thriving. Cranes coming back for the first time in 300 years, I think, to our Midlands waterways. And we've everything to gain from that, to pay people, to get the reward from the stored carbon as well as the restored nature. Critical in how we do this, in my mind, the politics of this, is that it is in a collaborative basis. It's working with local communities, working with forestry, farming, nature lovers across the country, and admitting there's uncertainty. If you look in the climate change assessment in land use, it keeps changing. We only really discovered the kind of downside of our forestry programme in recent years and had to amend our plans at the last minute to adjust to what the science was telling us. Even more recently, Teagasc, I think, came out with very useful analysis showing that actually the amount of land which is already storing carbon because it's not as drained as people had previously thought is a significant change. So we should admit uncertainty as we start devising our plan. We should admit that we'd have to learn by doing. No one has the magic secret formula, or no one's going to tell anyone else what the exact approach is. It's by collaboration, it's by cooperation that we'll make this leap. I would like to agree, firstly commend Minister Noonan. I think the work you've done on this has been hugely significant. When you say the Irish Government and the Irish Parliament and the European Parliament was won over on this because of those Irish votes, it's true, but I think a lot of the credit that goes down to yourself in terms of how this has been presented and how we have approached it within our own government. I was proud to be a member of the European Council when it was discussed and debated and agreed. I was fascinated to see that those political parties who had opposed it suddenly started to hear the actual silent majority that you don't hear saying, actually, we do not want nature destruction. I'm sorry, we do want it to return, and to change the vote. Others changed back again, unfortunately. But I think what that vote, those Irish MEP votes that really did win the day, were because the Irish people buy into this. The Irish people understand the desire to restore nature in every county, in every parish, in every community. I'll finish, if I can, with my own local river and parish in Milltown. And I'm old enough to have remembered that river, the Dodder, my local river, being utterly polluted. It was not known as Milltown for no reason. It was an industrial river where we did a lot of our manufacturing, our processing of chemicals. And the river, as a child, I remember you could see sections of it was white with ammonia. It was completely dead, killed. And now, if you walk that river, you see dippers and herons and kingfishers and otters. It's incredible that when you allow nature to restore itself, she does it in a dramatic, very quick way. That should give us real confidence and hope that restoring our own communities, this is the global problem, but actually we should bring it back local. And in doing that, it's not just an economic benefit, it's not just fulfilling European regulations, it's actually pride of place. It's a sense of joy that it brings, it's a sense of connection, and ultimately as well, our own security on this planet, which at the same time is in deep peril. You cannot speak about nature at the moment without noticing and commenting on the fact that the global sea temperatures just in this last year have gone off the dial, have completely jumped. The parts per million CO2 concentration in the last month have risen 4 parts per million. February, the warmest month ever, but like by off the scale measure. And that reality is going to also put nature under stress and further challenge us. So we need to act fast. We need to act fast in the nature restoration law we have here, but in everything we do to secure our own future and to maintain the wonder that is in the world. Thank you.
Okay. Sinn Féin inis. Darren or
Here, look, I welcome the opportunity to speak on the protection and restoration of nature and the need to make progress in Ireland. Sinn Féin completely supports and prioritises the need to protect, restore and enhance nature. The scale of the crisis that confronts biodiversity cannot and should not be understated. On the nature restoration law, Sinn Féin's rejection last week was not a rejection of the intent and the purpose of the law. We must work to protect the complex, interconnected ecosystem that is the beating heart of our economy and society. However, without concrete funding measures, our efforts will fall short, and we simply cannot afford to get this wrong. From my perspective, last week the question was framed incorrectly, because for us in Sinn Féin the question of if we should do this has already been clearly answered. Instead, rather than asking if we should do it, what we should be asking instead is how we do this. And we know that the government's propensity to set targets without a dedicated, detailed and resourced roadmap of how to get there is no way to do business. It is certainly no way to ensure success. This was made abundantly clear by the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, who pointed out that the government has comprehensively failed to adequately fund, implement and enforce existing national legislation, national policies, EU biodiversity-related laws and directives. By simply paying lip service to something in theory at a multilateral level far removed from the lived realities means very little when it comes to translating these lofty ambitions into practice. It has to work in reality. It has to work on the ground and with the people that will be charged with carrying out these measures. Now that the nature restoration law has been passed by the European Parliament, it is incumbent on legislators to ensure the right supports are put in place to aid the achievement of our nature and climate targets. We therefore believe that a dedicated, ambitious funding stream should be put in place at European and national level to support the delivery of these vital biodiversity targets while protecting and enhancing the income of workers on the front line of nature restoration. We need a just transition. In Sinn Féin, we believe it is critical that the value we place on our ecosystems is reflected in how we resource this transition. This is why we proposed in the establishment of a dedicated nature restoration fund in our alternative budget, alongside a suite of other measures, including the expansion of publicly owned and accessible green spaces and natural areas, increased investment in afforestation and in urban green spaces, the expansion and restoration of our national parks, and increased funding to develop skills and expertise in biodiversity at a local and national level. In addition to this, increased funding for local authorities, the establishment of a native woodlands fund, increased funding to the Irish Environmental Network, increased resourcing of environmental NGOs, expanding and restoring our national parks, and increasing resourcing of biodiversity skills staffed on Bord Pleanála and in Mara. In addition, investing in horticultural farming and establishing, which was a recommendation in the Citizens' Assembly, a peer-to-peer scheme for farmers working to protect and restore nature. And significantly, partnership, collaboration and engagement must be part of all of this. Those who are impacted the most by requiring certainty that they will not be the collateral damage in this process. Many who have done a lot of heavy lifting, and the Minister acknowledged it, many who have done a lot of heavy lifting in the past are bruised by that experience. The work of preparing the National Restoration Plan will be hugely important, and there needs to be commitment in terms of funding and in terms of support. The Minister referenced the Climate Fund. We heard clearly from farmers and from rural communities that they are concerned that that is, in the first instance, a way out in the future, in post-2026, and it's only related to capital investment. So the detail of that must be spelled out, Minister. It must ensure that it supports the practical measures to restore nature, and it needs to happen now, in our firm opinion. It is incumbent upon us to bridge gaps, to reach mutual understandings as we respond to this crucial challenge. We in Sinn Féin absolutely believe that restoring nature and protecting our Indigenous industries can and must go hand in hand. Now is the time to work together and put in place a pathway to nature restoration that delivers for our workers and our planet. Sinn Féin believes that the state has a key role to play, that it can lead the way, in fact. This government cannot expect family farms and rural communities to make changes that the government itself are unwilling to make. All in all, we know this is an urgent issue. It cannot be ignored. We also need strategies that don't kowtow to wealthy vested interests that have powerful influence. It suits some vested interests to create a divide between rural and urban. But we must reject this false dichotomy, because the evidence shows, regardless of where you live, rural or urban, people care about the environment and they recognise the need to restore nature. We must be sure to have nuanced and informed discussions that are grounded in fact, science and of the experience and knowledge of stakeholders. We must not be led by misinformation and by the pursuit of profit. What is needed now is a collaborative and decisive action that encompasses farmers and rural communities as key allies by supporting them in the transition, respecting their knowledge, grounding the process in science and fact, and by addressing the socio-economic challenges that may arise. We can and will find a way forward. Our future and that of future generations depends on it.
And I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak on the nature restoration law and, as my party spokesperson on agriculture, to very clearly outline our position. And I have been quite bemused in recent days in relation to our vote at the European Parliament and the response and reaction to that vote. From the very first discussion on nature restoration and the law proposed at EU level, we engaged proactively at every point. We met farm organisations, we submitted amendments at EU level at every single opportunity available to us, unlike some other MEPs, and we engaged constructively. We didn't sit back and say we don't like this, nor did we scaremonger. And I've listened to what the Minister said in relation to scaremongering around CAP, around voluntary. At no stage did we scaremonger on any of those issues, nor did I, nor would I. We set out 5 red lines. We set them out at EU level through amendments. I set them out here last year as an amendment when this topic was last discussed here, and we set them out in press releases several times. In fact, we could not have been any clearer. We looked for specific dedicated funding, voluntary, not mandatory, widespread public participation, a socio-economic assessment and compensation. And I totally acknowledge that some of that has been included, and I welcome that and I acknowledge it. And I do also recall a press release by my colleague last June in which he welcomed changes that we had achieved at EU level. That included a compensation scheme for farmers, and it also included a new chapter on funding, including a mandate for a permanent, dedicated nature restoration fund outside of CAP. When the text came before the Parliament in July, we were very satisfied that our red lines were met, and we were particularly glad that an amendment we posed on compensation was included in that text, and that read the financial compensation of potential losses by landowners and land managers directly due to the implementation of this regulation. And this was a key amendment, and Minister Noonan will know this because he attended a meeting I attended with farmers from the Midlands who came up here last year, particularly concerned at possible implications to their land by re-wetting that Bord na Móna were engaging with in the Midlands, and we were both at that meeting. And so for us, that amendment was extremely important, and it was extremely important that that was in the text, which it was in July, and we were very satisfied with that. However, the text we saw last week at the European Parliament included nothing on funding, and it included nothing on compensation. In fact, the part entirely on compensation had been utterly removed. Now, I, as party spokesperson on agriculture, met farmers. They wanted compensation. We agreed to an amendment in relation to that. We worked with them on it. And I certainly wasn't going to turn around when I saw the text last week and say, oh, well, actually, compensation now isn't there, but never mind, it's grand, we'll support it anyway. I wouldn't do that. The amendment was there, it was brought forward in good faith, and it disappeared in the text last week. And I wouldn't make no apology for our vote last week, and nor would I be concerned with criticism, especially from across the floor, in relation to our vote. I don't see how it would come as any surprise that as an MEP in the European Union you would work, you would put in amendments, you would have achievements in that, and then the text appears last week different to the text you supported in July, and you would just support it anyway. I mean, frankly, there wouldn't be point in having red lines in the first place. Secondly, and just as importantly, is the piece around funding. And many more than Sinn Féin said that funding was needed. It needed to be dedicated, long-term funding, it needed to come from the EU, and it should come to accompany what is a major and ambitious plan in relation to nature restoration. And I actually believe that the EU have missed an opportunity here at a time when farmers are really fed up in relation to the red tape and the many regulations that are coming from Europe. We know many farmers have been protesting in relation to this very issue. And this was an opportunity the EU had to say, yes, we are asking you to do more, but we are going to financially back you in order to do that. That wasn't there. Instead, it's let's keep more work on farmers who will be doing this, and we look at funding post-2027. That, to me, is not good enough. And from my view, there was nothing stopping that text saying that there will be a commitment to funding under the next multi-annual financial framework, but that commitment wasn't there. And again, I would genuinely fear that when the next MFF comes up, we know that one country alone can block funding on any issue, and I would be genuinely concerned that that may be the case post-2027. I also want to take this opportunity to raise an issue that has been brought to our attention by the Irish Natra and Hill Farmers Association, and they have raised an issue with another change from the text that was there in July and then appeared differently last week. And that is the fact that the text now reads that Member States should prioritise restoration measures on those Natura 2000 sites up to 2030. Now, of course, these are the farmers that are already doing most in relation to nature restoration. They are the ones that are hugely restricted in how they farm their land, and they already feel hugely let down in relation to the level of support they receive for farming in designated areas. But regardless of all of that, we say to them, yes, we support you being prioritised and you do more, and there's no funding from Europe to do it. I don't think that's fair, and I would ask the Minister to consider that very carefully in relation to our own national plan. And I do know that widespread engagement will take place, which I welcome, with farm organisations and with others as part of this. I also think it's really important that the issue raised by Minister O'Donovan of the OPW in relation to flooding and future possible impacts on flood relief schemes, that is looked at by government too. I think it should be responded to by the government as well, and I think that would be really important. And I think of Lough Functionagh in my own constituency, where another house now is about to go under. Pumps are just about keeping water away from that home, but because it is a so-called special area of conservation, nothing has been done, nothing at least that will be done in the next few years to help that community as their homes go under. Some homes have already been lost, but it is to prioritise instead what is a special area of conservation which is dying on its feet. There is nothing now living actually in that area of conservation. The MPWS haven't been out on the ground despite telling the EU Commission otherwise, and it is groups like that and issues like that that we need to make sure that this will have no impact on. And I was very concerned in relation to what Minister O'Donovan had to say on that, and I really think the government should respond to that and give communities some bit of clarification in relation to that. Now that the law is passed, it is essential that the farm organisations are brought around the table, that there is as widespread consultation as is possible. It is absolutely essential that farmers who will take part in this, and some farmers will be very happy to take part in it, and the voluntary nature of it is well and good, but if there are implications for neighbouring lands, such was the case with the farmers from the Midlands that we both met last year, then compensation is really important. And I recall actually, and the Minister will recall, those farmers when they came up from the Midlands, they weren't looking for money, they were looking for Bord na Móna to commit to do remedial works should there be any impact on their lands. I think that was a very basic ask. I think it was fair, and I think it should be considered by government again. Thank you.
The climate and biodiversity crises stand among the greatest challenges facing humanity. Action is needed, and there are two ways in which we can try and take those necessary actions. Either in collaboration with communities, with workers, farmers and other affected sectors, or we can try a top-down approach, finger-pointing, condescension and imposition of measures with little regard to those that will be affected. This government have repeatedly chosen the latter route, and Minister, it's failing. For all their talk, the Greens, along with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, have missed virtually every single target that they themselves set in relation to climate and biodiversity. Almost every measure is seen to be aimed at penalising local communities and ordinary citizens. There is virtually no collaboration, there is no engagement, and there is no sign whatsoever that Ireland or the EU is actually making any meaningful positive difference. Instead, we have antagonised communities, and Irish family farmers are fearful for their future. And the EU nature restoration law is probably a perfect example. Sure, who wouldn't be against, or who would be against nature restoration? It's as if the title itself should be enough to demand support. And the amount of commentary that I have witnessed by people who clearly didn't follow the progression of the EU legislation, certainly didn't understand the different stages of its passage or read the final text, is staggering. And then the level of snobbery of those from areas that won't be affected by its implementation towards those who are and who have very real and genuine concerns is actually breathtaking. I'm proud that Sinn Féin stands for meaningful action, working in collaborations with those who will be affected by measures, rather than joining in what was a European Parliament consensus that seeks to demonise and ignore them. We support the restoration of nature. It's imperative. If it is done right, then rural communities can benefit. But it can't just be about setting targets and hoping for the best and then at the last minute impose measures in order to reach those targets. And that has been the reality of implementing EU directives thus far. Targets must be accompanied by a plan. And that plan has to be developed in partnership with those who will be affected, not forced on them. The necessary funding for initiatives, incentives and support should be in place at the beginning of a plan, not at some undefined point in the future. And the absence of that plan and funding was the reason why Sinn Féin MEP Chris McManus rightly voted against the file that was presented to the European Parliament last week. And there should be no surprise whatsoever to the position adopted by Sinn Féin. The real unanswered question is how Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael MEPs actually supported a proposal that was flawed, that lacked the concrete funding measures that are absolutely essential to the restoration of the complex and interconnected ecosystems that we all depend on. It's ironic that the farmers that will be affected most by the approach adopted by the European Parliament are actually the poorest farmers in Ireland, and they are also those that are most eager to play a positive and constructive role in climate action and biodiversity. They are the farmers, for example, that use the least amount of artificial fertilisers and pesticides. They have the lowest stocking rates and the greatest levels of biodiversity on their farms already. And these are the farmers that know that they have a part to play in addressing the climate and biodiversity crises. So the starting point should be to acknowledge the incredible work that many of them have already done, producing what is among the safest and certainly the highest quality food in the world within the most stringent environmental standards on the planet. And much more, of course, needs to be done. And I don't know a single farmer that doesn't acknowledge that or believe that standards won't or shouldn't continue to rise. So the challenges then for those of us in public life is to put in place the framework that allows farmers to succeed while doing what is necessary for climate and biodiversity. And this government and the European Union are failing in providing that framework. This government in particular are very good at setting ambitious targets, but they are atrocious at actually meeting those targets. Nobody and no purpose is served by that approach. Not farmers or the rural communities that depend on them, not the environment. The government approach all too often amounts to hypocrisy, double standards and lecturing. So let me be very clear, Sinn Féin absolutely support a nature restoration law, but we will not support any nature restoration law, and especially not one that will drive potentially small family beef and sheep farmers out of existence for no purpose. The proposal before the European Parliament last week failed to commit the funding and safeguards necessary to deliver the environmental ambition without impoverishing farmers negatively or affecting Irish regions, particularly in the West. Those that supported the European Parliament restoration say they want nature restoration, but it appears that they want farmers to pay for it. It is the exact approach that has failed time and time again. Perhaps if these same family farmers had not been failed in every single iteration of the Common Agricultural Policy for at least the last decade, they might have come to this issue with a different perspective. But the truth is that we have been asking farmers to do much more while providing them with less supports in real terms every year. We now have a climate action plan that expects farmers to do more, but with no additional supports. There is now a nature restoration law that will expect farmers to do more, but again no guarantee of additional support. Instead, we're met again today with the dishonesty of a government that still pretends that farmers are receiving a benefit from the carbon taxes, of which they pay proportionally more than anyone else, instead of the reality that any new funding stream is just supplanting streams that were already removed. The parties of government and the European Union have made or stated that climate is a policy priority, but they simply haven't made funding that policy a priority. Sinn Féin had previously secured changes to the European Parliament's nature restoration law, which ensured that financial supports, including compensation, would be available to farmers negatively impacted, and we supported the law at that stage on that basis. But those gains were lost during the trialogue negotiations with the sign-off from this government. And the Minister has essentially said here today in the Dáil that government were going to support the nature restoration law regardless of what changes were made. And with those gains then lost, and with those safeguards for Irish family farmers lost, then so too was Sinn Féin's support. Because we approach this issue knowing as we do that it is imperative that we succeed, in the full knowledge that the stated objectives can only be delivered with a plan that is devised in collaboration with those who will be affected. And that is why it has been us, nobody else in this House, that have introduced actual proposals to protect and restore nature, including the establishment of a dedicated nature restoration fund. And that is why we remain committed to delivering nature restoration in partnership with rural communities and family farmers, because it simply, Lasconcorla, won't happen otherwise.
Just before moving on, I'd like to welcome our visitors to the gallery. This discussion is particularly pertinent to their future. So with that, I'm going to move on to Perche and Loch Dibre, a Haughey to Jed Nash.
Thank you very much, Lass. Ken Corla, and I too would like to welcome our visitors in the gallery this afternoon, and I can see that you're all watching and listening intently, because what we are debating here today is about our collective future. On the 27th of February, just last Tuesday, we witnessed an historic vote in the European Parliament. MEPs in Strasbourg voted to approve the first ever nature restoration law. And it is, as we know, the first new major EU biodiversity law since the 1992 Habitats Directive. And there's been much conjecture about the purpose of this legislation, both from the climate change deniers and what I describe as the climate change tolerators. Undoubtedly, this has caused confusion and some panic. However, the nature restoration law's aims are simple. It aims to restore at least 20% of the EU's land and sea areas by 2030 and all its ecosystems in need of restoration by 2050. And because it often goes unmentioned in this House, as a lot of European Parliament dynamics does, I hasten to add that the approval of legally binding targets to restore nature is a testament to the Socialists and Democrats' commitment to environmental causes. We in Labour are proud and glad to commend our colleague César Luena, S&D MEP from Labour Sisters, the Labour Party's sister party in Spain and chief negotiator on the nature restoration law, for his hard work and commitment in seeing this vital law passed. The groundbreaking nature restoration law addresses not only the loss of biodiversity, but also contributes significantly to combating climate change, enhancing agricultural resilience and meeting international commitments. We are not in ordinary times. 81% of Europe's assessed natural habitats are in poor condition. We're witnessing ecological collapse, living through an extinction event. Human-driven changes are seeing the world get worse and not better. And that's true even here in Ireland, where our geography often spares us from seeing with our own eyes the very scariest consequences of these changes. The songs of corncrakes, hen harriers and curlews have slowly gone silent in many areas where once they were heard. Algae covered Loch Ness, poisoning local wildlife and endangering human health too. And we see, of course, native tree species struggling for space. And it falls on us to change that. And I believe in the power of politics to make pivotal and transformational change. And politics and collective action are two of humanity's greatest inventions. So while often the debate on the biodiversity and climate crisis can tend towards misanthropy and misinformed outrage, I think it is worth seizing on hope. There is hope, and we all have agency. And we must realise the power we have as individual citizens, as activists, as communities, and indeed as a state, because all is not lost. All isn't lost. And such thinking, the negative fatalist thinking, serves no one. Humans are social animals, and while we are undoubtedly capable of damaging the world around us, we do have agency too, and we can fix things, and that is without question. We can help protect our world, and we can help our world to flourish, but only through collaboration. and the unity displayed by our own political grouping in the European Parliament in getting the nature restoration law over the line showcases the importance of working together to achieve ambitious environmental goals. Now, honesty, dedication and a unified commitment to tackling climate and ecological breakdown is the minimum that's required if we are to avert disaster. And unfortunately, it doesn't look yet as though we have arrived at that point of consensus. And that failure leaves everyone worse off, not least those from an agricultural background who are told to cultivate land and steer their business in a particular way, and who now have been told that they must do it another way. And we must resource and assist them to change. As Concurla, those who need a just transition most are most deserving of honesty from their political representatives. And to be fair, you get that honesty from Minister Noonan and his colleagues, because it is clear that adaptations are needed. So those who are being asked to help that process along do deserve leadership from those making the ask, and they are getting that leadership, and they deserve honesty from everyone in this House. Now, after some dithering last year, it was positive to see the two largest parties in government deciding to support the legislation. I don't think it would be fair to attack government TDs for doing the right thing. However, particularly coming up to European elections, voters do deserve to know what they are supporting if they vote for Fine Gael. That's notwithstanding the decision taken by the five Irish EPP MEPs. The European People's Party, the group to which Fine Gael belongs in the European Parliament, opposed the nature restoration law. And let us not forget that last July, EPP MEPs submitted amendments for total boycott of the legislation, and they were joined by the European Conservatives and Reformists, as well as the far-right identity and democracy groups in the Parliament, who tabled amendments calling for the legislation to be rejected entirely. Now, we do understand and we acknowledge that Fine Gael MEPs face down that not inconsiderable pressure from within the EPP to support those boycott efforts, and that's to their credit. Those Fine Gael MEPs did choose to engage with the process. That's a welcome departure from the very dangerous rhetoric we've seen from their EPP colleagues, and notably the EPP President, Manfred Weber. Now, while Fine Gael MEPs did support the vote, there are serious concerns about that centre-right grouping's approach to protecting our planet's future. The EPP isn't only content to coalesce with the climate-denying far-right, it actually courts those parties in an attempt to consolidate power. It's true that Fine Gael has sought to censure some of the most sinister elements of its European grouping, such as Viktor Orban's membership prior to his leaving in 2021. However, the grouping as a whole routinely stands in the way of the kind of progress that we need to see. The leader of the EPP, Manfred Weber, whom the EPP initially sought to make Chief Commissioner of the European Union, embarked on what can only be described as a personal crusade to kill the nature restoration law, and he was even accused of spreading disinformation, and this from the leader of the group in the Parliament. And that bad policy and those alliances with the hard right don't represent a fringe element in the EPP. They come from the very top, and we need to be conscious of that in terms of the European elections coming up and who we actually choose to send to represent us in those significant European groupings. And notwithstanding the important vote we're debating today, it's one of the many new measures which will be needed. An alliance of the right and far right after the elections in June is a very clear threat to environmental progress, and it would be disingenuous to highlight the skeletons in the government's closet alone. I've been deeply concerned by some of the actions of those in opposition, and it was mentioned earlier on, and they've responded, some of them, and some will later on from the independent ranks. Lots in the independent ranks have sought to undermine climate and biodiversity action at every opportunity, utilising dog whistles and straw-man arguments to sow distrust and conspiracy theories. And farmers and those in rural Ireland will need strong representation and advocacy to get that much-needed just transition I spoke of earlier. But they deserve to get it from those with their true best interests at heart. There will be no room for small farmers in the event of ecological collapse. Business will become completely unsustainable, except for those with the deepest of pockets. More supports are needed to support a move towards sustainable farming. But standing in the way of measures to make our country more sustainable are a short-term solution to a problem which stands to have dire short, medium and long-term impacts. It was also deeply alarming to witness Sinn Féin's MEP voting against this critical legislation in the European Parliament. Now, for some hours on Tuesday, it seemed that that party could not decide its own position. One European election candidate celebrated the passage of the nature restoration law after Sinn Féin's only sitting MEP had voted against it. It used to be the case that Sinn Féin in government would do one thing in the north and say something different down here. Now, if you want to represent Dublin, you say one thing, and if you're representing a more rural area, you actually vote on something completely opposite. And that is quite extraordinary. And it's not the first time that Sinn Féin has displayed a somewhat wavering commitment, putting it mildly to climate action. The party, as we know, also opposes carbon tax, despite the UN stating that the taxing of carbon emissions will be central for getting global warming under control. So at a time where urgent action is needed to address climate and biodiversity breakdown, the planet and all the species living here deserve courage, but most of all, they deserve honesty and leadership from their politicians. And we can bring about equitable solutions to this challenge, ones which actually do reduce inequality and actually provide business opportunities sustainably, rather than increasing pressure on our planet. And how would we feel if we thought the environment around us was in danger to such a degree that the plants and animals we no longer notice around us were gone? That's the future facing us, and the future facing future generations. The passage of the nature restoration law marked extremely significant progress and very welcome progress, and it is something that we can build on, because the cost of failing to do so is just too high. It is fundamental and it is existential.
Minister, last week the National Restoration Law was passed in Brussels, and I was listening to your speech in my office, and you said we have 24 months now to get what we need in place for this to work effectively. And I will be working closely with you, Minister, on those 24 months to ensure that the farmers aren't the ones that pay for national restoration. And I was very interested to listen to you in your speech to say that we made mistakes with designation in the past, and that is most definitely the case. In my county, we have a significant number of land that is designated, and the capital value of that land has been completely decimated. And in my experience, I have never seen landowners or property owners that this was allowed to happen to before. And the litmus test of restoration for rural Ireland will be if the capital value of that land is maintained. And that's something that we have to make sure happens. When the hen harrier designation came in my county, there was a scheme brought in with it, which was relatively attractive for the landowners. And for the first 3 or 4 years, they got a reasonable payment for the designation of their land. But that payment dried up to a trickle, and they're left with now a very small payment. Where they have nesting hen harriers, it increased slightly. But the blanket ban on forestry in those areas has absolutely decimated the value of their land, and we cannot allow that to happen with restoration. So, we will be seeing closely, and, we're here and we talk about food security and what Europe is going to do and sustainable food production. And, when you talk to farmers out on the ground, Brazil have announced in the last couple of weeks they're going to increase their beef production by 20% by 2027. That's at the expense of the rainforests. China is increasing domestic production of food very, very significantly, especially in regard to dairy products. They're not looking at emissions, they're not looking at climate change, they're only concerned with food security and driving forward food production in those countries. Now, I'm not saying that we don't produce sustainable food. Yes, by all means we do. But we cannot blindfold ourselves to what's happening in the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. And we have to be seriously concerned that there's not a universal global policy as regards to sustainability of food production. And at the moment, that is most definitely not happening. And Europe, they're most definitely the pioneers, but the rest of the world is definitely not following as we debate this here this evening. We waiting, Minister, And, will farmers whose land is adjacent to a re-wetting project get a written guarantee that the water table on their land won't be affected? And, I've met numerous farmers' groups who are extremely worried, especially about Cavan-Monaghan's land, because there is commercial farmers adjacent to Cavan-Monaghan land. And if that land is re-wetted, will it have an impact on their water table? And if it does, it takes away the whole economic viability of that holding. And those farmers have been looking for that written guarantee now for a number of years. And that guarantee hasn't been forthcoming. And this is something, Minister, that in the 24 months that we have in getting protocol for restoration, that most definitely has to be addressed. Upland areas, and there is a lot of cattle being produced in upland areas, specifically our suckler herd, and a lot of sheep production. And we have promoted the organic sheep production that's produced on our hills, and we have got a very significant niche market for them. Again, that is bound to be impacted by this restoration laws, and again the compensation has to be in place. Re-wetting of areas is obviously going to be a significant part of restoration. But we have a policy at the moment of a lack of maintenance of our rivers and streams. Is this going to continue unabated? And houses in my constituency are getting flooded, and increasing numbers each year, because the rivers and streams in the locality haven't been cleaned for a long number of years. A lot of very productive farmland is now being affected by the fact that streams and rivers aren't being maintained. And I'm old enough to remember when these rivers and streams were done on a regular basis. And when they were cleaned and maintained, there was significant fish populations in those rivers. So this nonsense that maintenance of rivers will destroy the habitats for fish it's just nonsense. The maintenance of rivers will not affect the fish population in those rivers. And I had an angling club on to me there a number of weeks ago who can't have angling competitions on the shore because they can't get access to the river banks because the briars, etc., are gone out of control. And a part, a historical, very good fishing part of the river shore. And it really makes nonsense that, that the lack of maintenance, is having such an effect on an angling sport. So, Minister, this has to stop, and this is having a huge economic impact on rural Ireland. And our rivers have to be what they're for. That's to get water away as quickly as possible when it falls on farmland, and allow that farmland to be productive. Re-wetting will create, habitats and back in bogs, etc. And I brought this point up with your minister previously here in a topical about invasive species. And I saw during the week, where you have extra funding. And I think now is the time, Minister, to tackle these invasive species. These habitats, especially, habitats in damp areas, will have a lot of ground nesting birds. And ground nesting birds, Minister, will not survive where mink is prevalent. We also have the problem of cormorants, which, are coming more and more inland and destroying large numbers of fish and, habitats as well, because, islands in rivers, etc., the foliage on those is being completely destroyed by them. But, we have to address the issue of these invasive species, because it's no use putting the structures in place that would allow these habitats to develop if the native species that we want to see in them are being killed off by mink, etc. And I think now, Minister, at this crossroads, when we have restoration, this restoration coming in, we need to put a budget in place that will deal with those invasive species and keep them under control. Forestry, and forestry has been mentioned in the speeches by the ministers there earlier. And I'm chairman of the Agricultural Oireachtas Committee in this Dáil, and privileged to be in that position. But our forestry policy is not working. And we have thrown significant amount of money at forestry in the last 12 to 18 months with a new forestry policy. But figures don't lie, and our acreage under forestry is actually now dropping. We have virtually no afforestation taking place, and farmers are deciding, with their feet, that it's not economical to plant forestry. So we need to go back and re-examine this. And, we have now designated land with a blanket ban, unenclosed land, a blanket ban, and, land with a certain level of peat, a blanket ban. And in our committee, we've had environmental scientists who come in before us and say that those blanket bans are actually hindering the creation of the habitats that we're trying to create. And at different stages of afforestation, in some or all of those areas, would actually help the creation of proper habitats for the wildlife and the bird life that we're trying to protect and allow to increase. So, we have significant targets for afforestation. And afforestation, is a key part to meeting our emissions targets, etc. And we need to go back and review where we are with forestry policy. In our programme for government, we have a target of 8,000 hectares per year of afforestation. I would say when this government comes to its close, whether it is in 6 months or 12 months' time, whenever the next election will come, we won't have met 8,000 hectares in the lifetime of this government. And that's a serious indictment of us and of a forestry policy that is just not working. I work closely with Cuív and the private contractors, and they, have what they see as solutions to the lack of afforestation. And I urge, and I have argued this with the Minister repeatedly, we need to get those stakeholders on side, and we need to show farmers that forestry can be profitable. And one of the major issues is that if you have forested land at the moment, you have to leave a third of that land idle. And people are not just going to make that decision, because when it's fit to clear fell in 35 years' time, the profitability of that land will be hugely hindered by the amount of land that has to be left for biodiversity. So we have to do the balance sheet. Forestry and having materials for building in 35 years' time will be hugely important. And in my view, the balance sheet isn't being done correctly at the moment. Minister, there has been media focus on the cap payments for land that will be in restoration. Those payments have to be guaranteed. That's absolutely essential. But guaranteed those for the next 5 or 7 years is not enough. They have to be guaranteed for several generations. Because the physical changes that will happen to land now under restoration won't be able to be reversed in any short period of time. So it's not just enough to guarantee those cap payments for the next 5 years or the next 7 years. They have to be guaranteed for a very extended period of time. And, people with land that will be designated now for restoration have to have environmental schemes in place that will allow the income lost to be gained through those various schemes. That is going to be the acid test for restoration. And if we have schemes in place, as well as having the single farm payment for those farmers, if we have schemes in place that will allow an income to be generated, that will ensure that this restoration will be a success. And it will maintain the capital value of those lands that will be in restoration. And I'll finish where I started. The litmus test is that land that is designated for restoration will not lose its capital value, and we have to use the next 2 years to ensure that that happens. Thank you, Laska.
Where to start? I must say the debate so far, speaking as someone who's worked and studied in this area since I was 17, the debate so far this evening has been incredibly difficult to listen to. When we have the chair of a committee talking about the sole purpose of a river is to drain water away from farmland, I do wonder whether we need an ecological education programme within the houses itself. I think we heard from a number of parties this evening, and I do want to specifically refer to Sinn Féin because that contribution today was also very, very difficult to listen to. We heard members talk about how nature loss and biodiversity crisis is the greatest challenge that humanity faces, and action is needed, and yet they vote against a voluntary programme that is designed to protect nature and to restore nature, and I just cannot fathom how that position was come upon, and indeed the fact that the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, their recommendations were used to defend that action, I think is particularly hard to comprehend. To be clear, the Social Democrats are very supportive of the nature restoration law. It is absolutely vital to stymieing the destruction that we're seeing in nature at the moment and for previous decades. And it is important that any measures that are taken are done collaboratively, in consultation with communities, but also they have to be taken quickly. We do not have time to wait. Nature does not have time to wait. And I think, Minister, that is my principal concern about this, is that there is a 2-year period, and I understand why that is necessary. But what I do not want to see is that any action in relation to biodiversity that we're currently undertaking or proposing, that is stalled whilst that 2-year process happens, because we cannot afford for that to be the case. I do also, you spoke earlier on, Minister, about how we were to have a constructive and honest debate today, and I absolutely agree. And I think whilst we can be critical of other members in the chamber, I think obviously you and your government are the ones that have and hold the power when it comes to nature restoration at the moment. And I do want to bring a level of a reality check into the debate as well. The major, I suppose, initiatives and successes that the government has seen to date, I think, could be summarised in my perspective as actual baby steps when it comes to the actual crisis we're facing and the need for action and the scope of that action. Whilst I do welcome those baby steps, they are not big enough, they are not quick enough, they're not fast enough, they are not at the scale that we need. So if we look at National Parks and Wildlife Service, I welcome the investment that's been put in that, but that came from a very low bar. They now get a funding of 67.5 million. Compared that to the 95 million that the horse and greyhound industry get in this country. And you can see how we are so out of kilter with our priorities, and you can understand completely how nature is dying around us as we talk. The 3.15 billion Climate and Nature Fund will start in 2026. Capital budget, no ring fencing for nature. That's needed now. And there does need to be allocations set aside for nature. 31 biodiversity officers, absolutely welcome them. But you're talking about 31 staff out of a total number of staff of 31,000 in local authorities across this country. Again, a drop in the ocean. The National Biodiversity Action Plan, there was a lot made of the fact that it is on statutory footing. However, the targets are so obscure that they're not legally enforceable. Many of them are 2030 targets, where we are indeed in a biodiversity crisis now. There was no change to the remit of Cahill and Bord na Móna, which I think was the absolute primary missed opportunity when it comes to that biodiversity plan. And I think if you had actually brought that in, I think we would have seen the systems changes that we need to see in this country in order to start addressing nature. And I think your government's once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do that and to turn that tide unfortunately, I think you failed on that. We're now 4 years into the 5-year term, and those systems changes are not there. One thing that keeps on being spoken about in relation to the nature restoration law is that actually the state could meet its targets out to 2030, 2040 on state land. That will not happen unless you actually change the remit of Cuív and Bord-na-Móna so that biodiversity is a key priority of theirs, that it is not just a commercial remit that they have. The solely commercial focus of these entities is absolutely destroying nature as we speak. This is the Cuív Strategy Engagement Report, where they have the carbon decision tree. So essentially this looks at their peatlands and says what they're going to replant and what they're not going to replant. And this is purely, they choose purely on a yield basis. They don't look at an area and say, A, we shouldn't be replanting on peatland, which is a no, and you agreed with me on that, Minister, that there should be no replanting on peatland. Unfortunately, it didn't get into the National Biodiversity Action Plan. But here Cuív is saying that that's not a feature for them. They don't review or look at the biodiversity potential of a site. What they look at when they see a piece of peatland, they look and see how much wood can we squeeze out of this and how much profit can we squeeze out of it. And until that is changed, we are not going to see changes in biodiversity that we need to see, and you will not meet your targets under the nature restoration law. In relation to, I'm just going to give you an example, because I think we have a lot of plans, a lot of proposals, a lot of press releases and nice publicity photos. But the reality on the ground is not reflecting those plans and proposals and the promises and the targets. And I'm just going to use one example, and that's the hen harrier, which is an iconic species. It's the most protected species in Ireland on paper, and it is one of the most studied species. And yet what we see is that from 2015, when there was a breeding population of 108 to 157, to 2022, we're now down to 85 and 106 pairs. It's a decline of a third. It's a 59% decline since 2000. This species will be extinct in 25 years unless we make the changes that are required. And that means making tough decisions when it comes to where Cuív are planting, how peatlands are being managed. Currently, there's more breeding happening outside special areas of protection for this species than there is within, because of the level of forestation that's in those SPAs. That doesn't make any sense at all. And what I will say to you, Minister, is that this is, when you get this right, you get it right for farmers as well. I listened to Jonathan Blackmore on Morning Ireland, where he talked about his land and how his land was, he used to see it as wasteland. When they were designated as having harrier status, he said it was like the death knell for them, for their family and for their land. But when they went through the process and they learned how valuable their land actually was, that the poor, unproductive land, that actually it was really rich and valuable and very worth fighting for. You could hear the pride in his voice when he spoke about that. So farmers and landowners are doing the heavy lifting when it comes to protecting this species. It is government that is failing. It is government that is overseeing the extinction of this species. They will be extinct in 25 years. And that will be the legacy of the Green Party in government if you don't get this right, if you don't make those changes to Cuív and Bord-na-Móna, to the Arterial Drainage Acts, all those different pieces of legislation, if they are not changed to reflect biodiversity and nature and the crisis that we're in, and continue on solely a profit basis, all those other laws, nature restoration law, will mean nothing. We will never meet them. They will just be a target. I think the Birdwatch Ireland Una Duggan said the government is quietly quitting on this iconic bird. And I think that to hear her say that was such a strong statement, but I think it's important to get it on the record. I don't think that's something you would want as your legacy. And I do ask that regardless of anything else that you get across the line before this government, the term is over, I would ask that you put in the heavy work now, get the Cuilche, Bord na Móna, get their remits changed, Minister, because if you want to leave a legacy for nature, that is how you do it. Thank you.
Now, Arashkaji and Realtis, Seán Haughey.
Thank you, Lascian Corla. I'd like to warmly welcome the vote of approval for the nature restoration law in the European Parliament last week. As we know, this law proposes to restore at least 20% of the EU's land and sea areas by 2030 and repair all ecosystems in need of restoration by 2050. It will involve the restoration of terrestrial, coastal and freshwater ecosystems, including wetlands, grasslands, forests, rivers and lakes. As regards peatlands, EU states will be obliged to bring forward restoration measures for drained peatlands on at least 30% of such areas by 2030, 40% by 2040 and 50% by 2050, and to scale up rewetting. These are ambitious targets and they will be very relevant for Ireland, and they will have a real impact on land use and agricultural lands. These significant measures are needed for the survival of nature and wildlife. As the Minister said here, nature is in trouble and we must help it to recover. We have a biodiversity emergency. It is not an exaggeration to say that our very survival depends on this restoration and recovery. In order to survive, we require oxygen, clean water, and of course food. For this, we need a stable climate, and soil, trees, peatlands and woodlands play their part in providing these basic requirements. In short, we need a healthy, functioning ecosystem to survive. Also of importance is nature as a recreational resource, which is so important for our general well-being. What we have now is degradation of our native habitats. 85% of our most precious habitats have an unfavourable status. Research indicates that every species category of Irish plant and animal is now under threat. So we need to act urgently and decisively. So what do we do? The Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Laws, published in April last year, made 159 recommendations. The Minister here published the 4th National Biodiversity Action Plan in January. This provides for a number of actions, such as the expansion of national parks, the tackling of invasive species, and the combating of wildlife crime, among other things. Most importantly, the plan is backed up by legislation imposing legal requirements for public bodies, and I'm referring, of course, to the Wildlife Amendment Act 2023. And we can very much look forward to the publication of a national nature restoration plan by 2026, following comprehensive consultations with all the relevant stakeholders. And of course, all this ties in with the EU's biodiversity strategy. Funding will also be provided through the €3.15 billion Climate and Nature Fund announced in the budget. We should also remember that many communities are already doing their bit, as indeed are farmers who are utilising the various support schemes in place. And there are other deputies in the House who know a lot more about these support schemes than I would. But it is encouraging to see so many nature restoration schemes taking place in urban areas, in my own constituency, for example, and very often supported by the local authority. We see the planting of derelict areas and wastelands and public open spaces and grass verges and imaginative planting, native species and organic varieties and so forth. And it does clearly demonstrate that our communities in our urban areas, they want to play their bit as regards nature restoration, and that there is a high level of awareness in relation to the environmental crisis which we now face. The reaction of farmers to the nature restoration law has been mixed, as we've heard. I believe, however, that they should be reassured by the knowledge that state lands will be used to the maximum for this purpose, that the proposed measures are voluntary for them, and that they will be incentivised through financial supports. The law also has the capacity to deliver extra income for farmers, particularly through ecotourism. In any event, there must be clear communication and consultation with farmers on all of these measures, and I have no doubt that that will take place. Last Concora, 13 Irish MEPs voted for this law in the European Parliament last week. Obviously, the two Fianna Fáil MEPs voted for it, but so too did the 5 Fine Gael MEPs. And Sinn Féin's Chris McManus voted against it, as did the independent Luke Flanagan. And I listened to the explanation by Sinn Féin here this afternoon of why they voted that way, and really it is very, very convoluted. It seems to me that when you're explaining, you're losing. Sinn Féin has an image problem when it comes to the environment. There is a general view that as a party it wants to have it both ways, and that, for example, it opposed carbon taxes. That's just one example that's very much in the public consciousness. So I really don't think we should get a lecture here this afternoon from Sinn Féin about how we voted last week in the European Parliament. But you do have to worry also about the future direction of the European People's Party, and there's been some discussion about that already here in this debate. It is clear that under their leader, Manfred Weber, that they are swinging sharply to the right. This will have implications for a number of issues, including migration and the Green Deal to tackle climate change. I think the European People's Party are meeting this week and determining their manifesto for the European Parliament elections. And by all accounts, from what I've seen so far, it is becoming a very right-wing grouping in the European Parliament. And I think that is something to worry about. The views of the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, who will be fronting the European People's Party on Israel, are also a cause for concern. But no doubt, Lascan Corla, all this will play out in the forthcoming European Parliament elections, so we will just have to wait and see what happens. I want to raise in this debate the plight of the native Irish honeybee in the context of this debate, as I said, the Apis mellifera, or the black bee. This is under threat from crossbreeding with non-native imports from hybridisation. I'm aware of EU law, EU regulations, and the requirement for free movement for livestock across the EU. But I do think we need to make a strong case to the EU in this regard. I understand that the government has commissioned scientific research into this issue, but it seems to me that there is no urgency as regards this matter. This issue is urgent. So can I ask you, Minister, where are we at in respect of this further scientific research at this stage. And what is the purpose of this research? Presumably, we are going to make a case to the EU for a derogation, and I certainly think if that's possible, we do need to do that. I would also like to say a few words about the linked issue of climate change. This is an existential crisis. Last year was the hottest year on record. The world is almost at the critical 1.5 degree threshold. I'm not sure that we had a debate in this House about the outcome of COP28 in December. I don't think we did. It has to be said that the summit was a reasonable success. There was a recognition of the need for deep, rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and a call to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. There was also a call to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 in keeping with the science. I also want to commend former President Mary Robinson for the crucial role she played at this summit. I welcome the EU Commission recommendation very recently on a target to cut emissions by 90% by 2040. We should endeavour to do this and, of course, to continue implementing the measures put forward in our ongoing climate action plan. I am aware that the fourth progress report on this plan has just been published. This indicates that there has been an implementation rate of 65% and that 35% of the proposed actions have yet to be completed. So there is still a lot of work to be done and we need to get on with it for all our sakes. So the nature restoration law, going back to that, the planning processes now have to be put in place. I think there's a target of 24 months for that, listening to the debate here. And so a lot of work needs to be done as regards this law as well, and no doubt it will involve a number of government departments. So I wish you well, Minister, in that regard. Just in the short time I've left to me, I'd also like to raise the Marine Protection Areas Bill 2023. I'm getting very concerned that this bill hasn't been published, and even then when it's published it has to be enacted before the next general election, and I think the timescale for that is becoming increasingly tight. So, Minister, again, whatever you can do to get that bill published, I think would be very welcome indeed. As regards my own constituency, we have some fantastic resources there. We have the North Bull Island Nature Reserve and also St Anne's Park, and they're widely used by the public, but they're also protected under the various laws. But you can see the benefit of those parks and wildlife areas for recreational use and for the general well-being of our urban population and the people who live in urban areas. And just to say, I give a shout out to Dublin City Council for the work that they are doing in protecting these recreational resources and ensure that they can be there for the benefit of future generations. Thank you, Lascan Corley.
People Before Profit Solidarity, Paul Murphy.
Thanks very much, Las Cavan-Monaghan. We in People Before Profit welcome the passing of the nature restoration law. If we had a member of the European Parliament, and clearly we hope we have at least one member of the European Parliament after the next European elections, well then, yes, we would have attempted to try to strengthen it, but we would have then voted for it. Why? Very simple. It's been laid out by a bunch of people, so at least the basic facts are not apparently in dispute in this debate, but the consequences of those facts clearly are. Why? Because we're in the middle of an intense biodiversity emergency, a sixth mass extinction event. Why? Because Europe-wide, 81% of the habitats that were supposed to be protected by the Habitats Directive 30 years ago are not in good condition now. Why? Because Europe is a disaster for biodiversity, and Ireland is at the very bottom of the pile in Europe. We're the 13th worst country in the world for biodiversity, a far cry from the greenwashed image that the Department of Agriculture, using public money, attempts to portray, trying to create the impression that big fields just full of grass everywhere is somehow how nature is meant to be in this country. Native forests once covered 80% of our land, but have now been reduced to a measly 1.5%. Almost none of our protected nature sites have effective conservation or management plans in place. There's massive biodiversity loss and damage even in the crown jewels of Irish nature, like Killarney and Connemara National Parks. We like to give out, correctly, the whole world should give out about the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, the lungs of the earth. But we have done, and it's not all of us in it to the same extent, but it has been done to our equivalent by draining, burning, extracting from our bogs. In light of all of that, the key nature restoration law proposal to restore 20% of land and sea areas by 2030 seems extremely modest. It is the absolute minimum that we should be doing to avoid further biodiversity meltdown. We regret that the final version that was passed was watered down a lot from the original version. We regret that, as you see again and again, in terms of European proposals, you have massive lobbying operations. I mean, something like there's hundreds of lobbyists, I think thousands of lobbyists for every member of the European Parliament, and massive pressure was put on politicians by those profit-hungry lobbyists for intensive agriculture, unsustainable fishing and the plantation forest industry. They engaged in an unprecedented campaign of scaremongering around this law, and they succeeded in having the proposal watered down. Unfortunately, Sinn Féin bowed to that pressure. They voted alongside Fine Gael's colleagues in the European People's Party, and hand in glove with the climate and biodiversity denying far right to try to block even this watered down version of the nature restoration law. They went along with the lobbyists who invented all kinds of dire consequences for food production and food security, all of which were complete nonsense. The truth, as a coalition of 3,000 actual scientists came together to say, is the exact opposite. It's a pity that Sinn Féin chose to follow the lobbyists rather than the science and the public on this, because 97% of respondents to a public consultation on this law supported legally binding EU restoration targets across all ecosystems. So we know that nature restoration is popular as well as ecologically essential. Sinn Féin needs to follow the science, listen to the people, not the lobbyists on this. And if they did, they would realise that protecting biodiversity and restoring nature will not undermine food production and food security, because nature and biodiversity are the whole basis of food security. It's absolutely true that no farmers, no food. It's also true, no nature, no food. Without nature and functioning ecosystems, eventually we will have no food production. The collapse of biodiversity, the consequence is, you lose out in terms of the number of insects and so on. The consequence is going to be a crisis in terms of food production in this country and worldwide. That's the trajectory that we are on, towards absolute catastrophe. So we need to take a long-term view of this, instead of what Sinn Féin and most of the leadership of farmers' organisations in this country and across Europe have chosen to take, by swallowing and regurgitating the lies of industry lobbyists, choosing to cut off their nose to spite their face. Rather than seeing this as a positive opportunity to reward farmers for farming in an environmentally friendly way, instead they sought to block it and to water it down. For years, this is the truth, and farmers are not to be blamed for it, we paid farmers to to degrade nature by overgrazing sheep in ecologically sensitive areas, by overstocking the best agricultural land and by over-expanding the national herd. That was done by farmers responding to incentives created by the state. That's the truth. Governments have responsibility for that. But that doesn't mean we should continue in that direction. We are in the midst of a climate and biodiversity emergency that is not just causing the 6th mass extinction event, but is threatening our own survival and that of the human race. Ultimately, hundreds of millions or billions of people are faced with death worldwide unless we act now to stop it. And so we need to change the nature of the incentives. We need to incentivise farmers not to bring us further over these catastrophic cliffs, but instead to richly reward them for restoring nature and reducing carbon emissions. Excuse me. This has to happen on a massive, unprecedented scale. It isn't about piecemeal environmental schemes which are tagged onto a whole model of agriculture that is based on industrialised agriculture that is deeply damaging to both biodiversity and the climate. Instead, we need a rational, democratically planned, sustainable food system where restoring nature, protecting biodiversity would become one of the main sources of farmers' income and in many cases would become the main source. We need farmers to save the future of our planet, and we need to make a political decision to pay them handsomely to do that. And that, for me, is the major flaw of this law. It doesn't justify voting against it, but the work now needs to be done on it, is that it does not specify the ways in which small farmers in particular will be paid to carry out the vital work of nature restoration. We need to listen to farmers on this, and we need to work with them to come up with the best ways of achieving this. And crucially, we need to ensure that it is small farmers, rather than the big dairy farmers and the agri-food industry, that reap the benefits of nature restoration. There needs to be a massive redistribution of wealth and resources in agriculture, just like in the rest of the economy. Thanks, Chair.
Now we move to Deputy Éamon Cuív, Government slot 13 minutes, Deputy.
I have to confess that I haven't had enough time to fully prepare for this. But there are a number of comments I'd like to make because I've been listening to the debate for the last hour. And I don't think there is anybody who argues against biodiversity, nature restoration as a kind of broad feel-good factor. But I wonder how much some of the people who are talking have of the complexity of land, of agriculture, of history. Nature restoration to what? To what it was like 100 years ago? 500 years ago? 1,000 years ago? Because we have been interfering with the landscape in this country, as was seen in the Cage of Fields, for thousands of years. I remember years ago I was in the department and I was a minister, and I had a great brainwave, I thought, about restoring fairly famous castles. And I mentioned this to one of the department officials, and he looked at me in the eye and he said, Minister, to what period do you want to restore it? And I said, what do you mean? I said, I want to restore it to a heyday. But he said it was a heyday of 300 years. And they kept building and adding and changing. Now, he said, will you tell me what period are you talking about? And it was a very valid question. So when we talk about nature restoration, it is highly complex. And it takes a huge amount of knowledge. And in many cases, the most knowledgeable about the capacity of their land are traditional farmers who have been farming land for generations in the one area. One of the interesting projects that's going on at the moment is trying to entice the corncrake to come back. I don't know much about the corncrake, but I'm learning fast. And I'm going to mention a case of one particular island off the coast that was highly inhabited, in East Turbot. The nearby in East Turk would be similar situation, but I've been in Inishturbert more often than in Inishturk. And I know one of the people who grew up there, who now has a holiday home there. And she explained to me that there were 100 breeding pairs when she was a child, but the island was full of houses. And the reason was because they had a mowing pattern that suited the corncrake. And if you don't have that mowing pattern, the corncrake won't survive. So what actually happened was that when the people left the island, the corncrake stopped breeding and they disappeared. And now in Inishbofin and Turbot and all these islands, they have programs that have human intervention to actually achieve their objectives. I hear a lot of people talk about wilding. Let's rewild the hills, let's rewild this, let's rewild that. Well, there are parts of Connemara, if you wild them, you'll get rhododendron. But the same people who wanted to rewild are telling you, no, hang on a second, we don't want rhododendron. In other places, you would get firs, bracken, and heather growing to a very woody state, which would give you the most fantastic tinderbox if you wanted it, accidentally or otherwise, if a hill were to go on fire. So what I'm trying to put across here, this is a highly complex. I think a lot of people would say that there was a lot more songbirds there 50 and 100 years ago, and I'd agree with that, although thankfully where I live, every day you get up now and this time of the year, you hear the birds singing. But one of the reasons for that was small amounts of people tilling an acre or 2 acres, putting potatoes and oats and so on, and that's gone. And now we have monoculture because we pay people for monoculture. And a lot of these acre schemes and so on pay for monoculture. I could never understand how under the REP scheme there wasn't a well-funded scheme that said that if you tilled a half an acre or an acre of land for vegetables and for whatever, because it's actually very good for nature. So I think we need to be careful about the term we use and the meaning for it. Because as far as I can see, as somebody who went from the city and had to learn fairly fast on my feet in a rural area, this is highly complex. Now, the people who actually know most about how it was and what was the ecological balance are not, if I might say so, people who've done academic courses. A lot of that knowledge is more deeply ingrained in the rural community. I do agree with Deputy Murphy, and I'd be very conscious of this, that yes, the headage payments were to rush your blood to the head to try and increase income, when you had headage payments and sheep and you had the disadvantaged areas payment in the way it used to be. And yes, it did encourage numbers and overstocking, and I actually was the minister who started the destocking, if the record is checked. And I was the one who went to the hill sheep farmers, as somebody who had worked with hill sheep farmers, had been a hill sheep farmers manager of a cooperative, and I went to them and said, we're going to destock, but I paid them, and I paid them well to destock, because they have to put bread on the table like any working family in this country. And that's often overlooked. There was a letter sent by the Commissioner for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries, and I do not trust Europe. I'll be honest, I don't trust Europe. I don't trust that Europe trusts itself, because I don't think it can tell you. So in the end of it, he came to the issue of will farmers be compulsory forced to do anything, and he obviously had said no, it wouldn't be, and so on. But then he came to the issue of the agricultural payments. And he said, regarding your concern on the payments under the Common Agricultural Policy and the Nature Restoration Law, the term condition is only used in relation to habitat types listed in Annex 1 and 2, which are quite, first of all, extensive in the west of Ireland. Very extensive in the areas where they've never destroyed willfully with intensive farming. There is no direct link between the classification of an area of a habitat type listed in Annex 1 as being in good or not good condition under the Nature Restoration Law and the respect of good agricultural and environmental conditions, GAECs and statutory management requirement, SMRs under the CAP. It is quite possible that all obligations under each GAEC standard and the SMRs are respected in a given area, and at the same time, such an area hosts an Annex 1 habitat that is not in good condition. But then we come to the crucial sentence. CAP payments depend on definition and conditions as set out in Regulation EU number 2115/2021. And in the CAP strategic plans, NRLs neither interfere with these conditions nor amend the CAP applicable regulations. But what could amend the CAP applicable regulations, and this is why I don't trust them, is the present CAP finishes in 27. And is anybody telling me that there won't be a call for an alignment with nature restoration in relation to payments post-2027, and that the people who are so elegant in their version of what nature restoration here won't be back saying, if you don't comply to a new GAEC, you ain't going to get paid. So a lot of these things lead to income uncertainty. Now, I think every deputy in the House would accept that if we had huge income uncertainty built in on a 7-year cycle to any other job, structurally built in by the state and by Europe, there'd be outrage. And then people wonder why farmers give out. Now, I know very few farmers, and I wouldn't have much dealing in recent times with the very intensive farmers down in the southeast and the south. And I wouldn't have the knowledge. I more have knowledge of extensive farmers. And the reality is, there are lots of pressures in their lives. And like everybody else, one of the biggest pressures in their lives is to have an adequate income to live in the area you live. I hear a lot of talk about adequate income. But sometimes the schemes introduced to solve one problem create another, and they create another distortion. And another phenomenon that has come in, hugely in compensating farmers, are schemes that are highly complex for the most innocent of farmers, the lowest stocked of farmers, who are very lowly stocked and don't have an awful lot of stock, and therefore it's not worth their while setting up huge computer records and so on. And therefore they're the ones that are suffering the income loss. So, as I said, I fully accept nature restoration. I have to see a lot. I see a lot more wilding or farmland not being farmed than I did. And one of the interesting phenomena, if anybody comes to our area, is that it's very hard to see the lake anymore, because the bushes have grown up all along the road. Now, whether all of that is 100% a good thing, I think we need to have a debate. So you see a lot of places where there had been traditionally, long before mechanical devices became common on farms in the area, the little drains were cleared, the hedges were cut. They made very, very good hedges. They were very thick because they didn't use a machine. They cut them and folded them into themselves and so on. And I think a lot of people would hanker back for those days. But instead of hankering back and say, well, let's recreate them, they're actually creating something that's totally different, that's going to have a totally different effect. And in certain ways, they're not dealing with the biodiversity challenges that mixed farming had created a much more diverse ecology. And now that we have virtually eliminated in huge swathes of the west of Ireland any mixed farming, in other words, any type of people doing any sowing or tilling or growing of vegetables or potatoes or anything. And therefore, I think this debate needs to be less emotive. I think it needs to be less, giving out about, you're not doing it the way we're telling you, even though we've never farmed in our lives. And a lot of that is going on, that people who've never farmed in their lives, who've never worked farms, are telling people who know the land, understand the land, how to solve the problem rather than consulting with them. And if I had one plea out of today, I would say, protect people's income. People have to live. And if we get rid of all rural habitation, close all the schools, destroy all our communities, we're destroying something that's equally diverse and valuable.
Thank you, Deputy.
And on the other hand, work with the people who know. And the people who know are the people who've been farming for generations in the same place.
Thank you, Deputy. We move now to a government slot again. Deputy Marc Cathasaigh, 13 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson. And I'll first of all say, with Deputy Cuív, there's sometimes I disagree with him, and there's more times I agree with him. But I always listen to him, because it's always worth listening to what he has to say. He's always thought it over very deeply. Bhvala me Cathasaigh Boyer just the Lua sa Seachtain in the Hallmead on lewer Michael Cronin on Gaeilge agus Neco Leocht Irish and ecology, and Tasha da hangak. It's there in the two languages. Agus Mata Saimagut Viheg Sulacht no an Eco Leocht agus sa Gaeilge. It's few ALF. It's really worthwhile read. It's not a heavy read. But it is very interesting, very thought-provoking. Minister, we have frogs in the garden. One of the neighbours up the road has a little small pond. I make sure to keep a couple of corners that are kind of friendly enough to them. And if you ever see a 7-year-old, and I'm sure you have, I'm quite sure Minister Noonan has anyway, if you see a 7-year-old trying to catch a frog in your back garden, it's quite something. And it does bring home that sense of connection and that sense of joy that Minister Ryan spoke about, that a connection with nature brings. Going back to last summer, we got one of those rare days out in the Gillamine, close to where I live in Tramore. One of the few days where there wasn't, heavy swell. The ocean was still, and the visibility in the water from standing just up on the pier, actually at Newtown Cove rather than the Gillamine. You could see about 30 feet down into the water. The sun was shining just right. And the sprats came in. And you could see down through the whole column of water, them glistening. And my three bios spent fully an hour dive bombing into 30 feet of wonder. But these things are rarer and rarer. I can't talk about nature without turning to one of my favourite poets. I don't know if I'm allowed to quote an English poet in here. It's usually Seamus Heaney, but in this case it's Ted Hughes. And one of his best known poems is Hawk Roosting. And it's written from the point of view of the hawk. And it closes, the sun is behind me. Nothing has changed since I began. My eye has permitted no change. I am going to keep things like this. But it's not within the compass of the hawk roosting to keep things the way that they are, or the way that they were. And we feel this loss all around us. And we feel much the poorer for this loss. Anybody who's done as many circuits of the sun as you or I have, Minister, can see it within our own lifetime, can see how those voices all across our natural world are being stilled and are falling into silence. And so it is critical that we have passed this law, this nature restoration law. And I am going to talk about those aspects that I think have been largely ignored within this debate. Because as the Minister well knows, Article 9 does deal with agricultural ecosystems, and a part of that article deals with re-wetting. That has dominated the debate, and we've had very little discussion of the other articles that are equally important and probably equally as challenging. But I do want to return to something a previous speaker said. A previous speaker talked about your legacy and characterised it in a particular way, characterised it as a legacy of failure. I want to repudiate that utterly. If we're speaking about the legacy that you have delivered as a minister, we can look to the reform of the MPWS, the funding of the MPWS. We can look to a first national park in, I think, some 25 years. We can talk about the designation of close to 10% of our marine waters as MPA. You can correct me on that figure, Minister Noonan, if I'm wrong. And I think critically, we'll be able to point to this piece of legislation as an important part of your legacy. Because there is no doubt in my mind when I look at the previous votes, this last vote wasn't quite as close. The battle was won in many senses. And I do accept some of the criticisms from Deputy Murphy around the concessions that were made in order to get this law across the line. But one of the earlier votes passed by dint of the choices made by the Irish MEPs. That was the margin. Had the Irish MEPs gone in a different direction, this law would have failed. We would not be speaking about the nature restoration law. And I know that each one of those MEPs had Grace O'Sullivan and Kieran Cuff, our Green MEPs, in one ear, and I know that they had yourself in the other ear. And I think that was critical. And I think without that intervention, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be discussing this piece of legislation. So I think, Minister, that is the legacy, and a very positive legacy. And I can think of no other Minister for Nature that has had the positive contribution that you have had. So I think that's something to be entirely proud of. And it's very easy to whinge from the ditches. And I would recall the words of Ron Finlay, who's the guerrilla gardener of South LA. He says, if you want to meet with me, grab a shovel. And I would say the same thing about nature restoration law. It's easy to sit and criticise. I think if you want to be part of the solution, roll up your sleeves, pitch in. Just to return to some of the articles, as I mentioned, and I do think Deputy O'Cuiv's intervention, there was great insight in it, because he's correct. We cannot talk about returning to some better imagined past. The river doesn't flow in that direction. But what we can try and do is to work towards a brighter imagined future that we, all of us, work towards. And I'd say again, Deputy O'Cuiv is right in terms of the balance we need to strike between rewilding and restoring. Because in fact, the restoration of our nature in this country is going to require significant human intervention. Not just in terms of the different types of habitat we try and create, because we know that there are certain habitats, man-made, man-managed habitats, that actually have great nature value. But also he correctly identifies things like rhododendron, invasive species, that these can't be allowed to dominate, that there will have to be human intervention in terms of preventing overgrazing, in terms of preventing the spread of invasive species. And he's absolutely right as well when he says that those people best placed to engage in that restoration process are the people who know the land best, the people who have worked that land for many years. I do want to mention those other articles which get so little attention in this debate. Article 4, restoration of terrestrial, coastal and freshwater ecosystems. We have seen such loss in terms of our pristine waters down through the last decades. And we know the reasons why, and we can obfuscate and we can point to human settlements if we so wish. But we know it's because we have pushed our agricultural systems to the limits, whereby the pressures that is placing on our freshwater systems is becoming untenable. Article 5 deals with the restoration of marine ecosystems. That's going to be critically important in Ireland. We know that actually our land mass is only 1/10 of our territory, that most of what we call Ireland is actually under the waves. And so we'll have a huge part to play in terms of regulating overfishing, in terms of what type of fishing we allow, in what areas, what parts of our marine territory we are going to pick to protect. Energy from renewable sources is outlined in Article 6, because there is going to be a tension between food production, energy production, and things like nature restoration. And we're going to have to be honest about that and figure out what that balance is. Article 8 deals with urban ecosystems. This is going to be a huge challenge. I can walk to and from where I'm staying here in Dublin, I'll see some street trees. What other part of nature will I encounter in the centre of Dublin? A person who lives in an urban environment, where do they go to find a frog in the back garden? It's few and far between. So that is going to be as challenging as any other part of this law. And something that I want to spend a little time talking about as well is the fact that the current system isn't working for people. And it's particularly not working for people who are on those marginal lands. I spent a bit of time with the guys from the Cummer Uplands EIP. And they had spent their time in that project actually getting to know their landscape better, getting to know the names of the plants, the animals that live in the landscape. Really, speaking to them, it really enriched them in terms of their understanding of the place where they had lived all of their lives and for generations. But the model of sheep farming that's available to those guys who are farming on a cobbonage, it doesn't pay the bills. Incredibly hard work. And it doesn't make sense for them. It doesn't make sense for them economically, and it doesn't make sense to anybody ecologically either, because the damage that their model is doing is putting the whole fragile landscape at risk. One of the real challenges I think we're going to have in terms of explaining the implications of this law and making sure that, that we get the buy-in. Brian O'Donnell, Director of the non-governmental organisation Campaign for Nature, he was speaking in the wake of COP15 in Montreal, the biodiversity COP, Minister, that I know you attended. And he said if we were to have any hope for the success of the 30 by 30, the 30% restoration target that was agreed in Montreal, as you'll well know, it has to be supported by, embraced by and led by local people. The community part in this is absolutely critical. And something that I think we have to do, and I think the land use review is critical in this as well, is we have to be able to explain to people, we have to help them imagine what this new landscape looks like. A landscape in which we make room for our rivers, we make room for our nature, we make room for renewable energy production, which will demand a certain amount of land use. We make room for food production. We make room for carbon sequestration, water systems, and human amenity. And I think we have to help them see that landscape so that they can understand it, because I'm firmly of the view, if that we can imagine that landscape, we will see that it is that brighter imagined future, and something that I think we all want to work towards. I can't leave this debate pass without mentioning the screening that I hosted in the AV room this week of Birdsong. Seán Ronayne, who people will know from his appearance on the Tommy Tiernan show, has set as his mission the task of trying to record every bird species that's in Ireland. He only has 2 left. He's nearly there. The film is beautiful. If anybody here has a chance to go see it, go see it. Beautifully shot. A huge credit to Ross Bartley, who's the cinematographer, Kathleen Harris, who's the director. But ultimately, it becomes an elegy for a world that we're losing. One of the most moving things was the recording of the ring ouzel, the last breeding pair in Ireland. And it's the sound of extinction. It's the sound of a world that's passing. We are possibly the last generation who has the opportunity to arrest this. Go see this film, get out into the back garden with the frogs, go swimming with the sprats, reconnect, and let's make the difference that we absolutely need to see in order to preserve our natural world for future generations.
Thank you, Deputy. We move now to the Sinn Féin slot Deputy, Rory O'Murchú, 5 minutes.
Cahill. There has been much commentary in relation to Sinn Féin in relation to the nature restoration law. And I welcome everybody that has commented in relation to how we voted, but also then continued with their speech in relation to attacking the nature restoration law. In fairness, it's been put quite clearly by Deputy Kerrane, by Deputy Carthy and by Deputy O'Rourke in relation to why Chris McManus voted the way he did and the decisions that we made as regards. And I don't think anyone should have a difficulty with parliamentarians at a European level or at a domestic level or at any level that they operate trying to improve on a particular law. Well, now the law is in place, it is in action, and we have a period of time in relation to make it work here and now, and I suppose that's the bit that matters. And I think, as has been said by many others, nobody is going to be against the idea, or I'd like to think they won't be, of nature restoration. And I'd also agree with Deputy O'Casey. I think it was definitely worth listening to Éamon O'Keefe in relation to what he spoke about, and that's, I suppose, there has to be some reality in relation to when we're talking about nature restoration and when we're talking about biodiversity, and we all know the issues that exist, and Minister, we've interacted on this many times before. It's also a case, I suppose there needs to be a reality check, and I'll throw one into it. Like, I'm from Dundalk, actually, and you talk about you're talking about where I live is actually redeemed land, so like I'm assuming that nobody is considering re-wetting it, because that would create particular issues. And in fairness, all joking aside, I think if there are other issues, because we all know the huge plans there are in relation to CFRAM and flood protections, we also need to make sure that we don't have other laws unintentionally impacting in relation to being able to deliver upon that. But look, we have the nature restoration law. We all know what we want to see. We all know that we want to make sure that as much of this, you know what I mean, that in an awful lot of cases there will be farmers, there are public lands, and this will be possible to do in a voluntary way. So we should ensure that that happens, and we should ensure that there are no obstacles in relation to it happening. But I think it's been said by many others for a long, considerable amount of time that sometimes there has been a particular narrative in relation to pitting farmers against an environmental lobby, and I think it's utterly unfair, and it doesn't actually work for anybody. And I recall being at an IFA meeting lately, and here I've quoted this many times before, so apologies if I'm repeating it in here. Not hardly the first time a sentiment or an idea was repeated in this illustrious chamber, but it was a former president of the IFA, and there was some element of giving out in relation to obviously the form filling and the particular, I suppose, hoops that farmers sometimes see that they have to go through, and sometimes they feel they have to provide the same information to multiple different agencies. But in fairness, the answer that was given was straight out. Hold on a second. See if you're talking about running a business, you're going into a bank, you're having any conversation, the first thing that's on the agenda is sustainability. And that's where we have to get to. So I think there is an acceptance among the farming community in relation to whatever moves need to be made. But we really, and again, sometimes you get fed up saying the same things, but it is a case of working alongside people to actually deliver on what is on what needs to be delivered. And why wouldn't we? Because look, it's that point of we know the various crises they are across the world at the minute. We know the fact that what we really need to make sure is that we have an ability and a facility to actually be able to deliver food. We know that we're amongst the best at delivering that in an environmental way. And any changes that need to be made, we need to work alongside farmers. And yeah, many have said it before. In fairness, farmers followed incentives. That's what they've done over many, many years. And I don't know how many farmers I've spoken to that the reason they got into dairy farming was on the basis that somebody from Teagasc or someone from the department rang them up and said they were looking for a young farmer that might be interested in doing this. So look, if we are looking at changing the way we do things, well then we need to have those sort of conversations in relation to what will also provide a sustainable way for farming and farmers into the future, because we know that many farmers don't believe they have this at the minute. But look, we have a period of time, we need a plan, it's as simple as that, and I know that's very easy said, but we need something that's doable and that can be put into play. Minister, unfortunately I may have overshot my time. I had intended to bring up the particular issue, because we're talking about biodiversity. I think there is an issue that has been brought up lately in relation to the dangers at what is now the nuclear waste facility at Sellafield. I have been in contact with the Department of Foreign Affairs through the Committee for the Environment. I have got answers back from the EPA and also from DEC. I'm not sure that they're up to scratch. I think we need to look at this. What we're talking about, one of the most hazardous spots in Europe as regards nuclear waste.
Thank you. Now, I haven't gone soft or anything, but we are ahead of time. So, Deputy Murchú, you got a little leeway. So, next is our Rural Independent Group, Deputy Mattie McGrath, sharing with Deputy Richard O'Donoghue, 5 minutes each.
Good morning, good Cahill. Yes, in the heart of Ireland, a storm is brewing. The rural communities, the backbone of this country, feel abandoned and betrayed. The culprit of this betrayal is a green agenda being driven by NGOs and indeed by the Green Party and fully endorsed by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. This agenda prioritises environmental conservation over the livelihoods of farmers and the viability of rural Ireland. And they can work hand in hand, and farmers are great custodians of the land and have been for decades. The Green Party now in this new push is telling them how they should behave. We heard from Éamon and Cuív about the cornflakes. Indeed, I remember cutting hay myself when the rotary mowers came out and starting and in the middle and ensure that they wouldn't be pinned and they would escape. And on February 27th, a pivotal vote on the future restoration law, the nature restoration law, took place in the European Parliament. Our Ireland's 13 MEPs, only 2 opposed it. The vote was tight enough, with 329 MEPs in favour and 275 against. Those 2 Irish MEPs who stood against the law were Luke Flanagan and Chris McManus, both members of the Left Group in the European Parliament. However, Mr McManus later tweeted that his vote against the new law was an error, calling doubt on Sinn Féin's stance on this issue. I was surprised with Sinn Féin's stance on any issue lately. The law, as I said, received support from the 5 Fine Gael MEPs and indeed all the Fianna Fáil. Didn't name them out. Everyone knows who they are. But I will name Mr Seán Kelly in Munster and indeed Mr Billy Kelleher. And Mr Kelly was telling us a while ago that, lamenting the fact that 75% of all legislation now is passed in the European Parliament, and here he goes and passed this draconian law. And they have the audacity now to go around holding meetings and go looking on farmers' doors looking for support when they've abandoned them. So let it be clear, all these MEPs who voted this new law and their respective political parties have turned their backs on rural Ireland completely and totally, all at the behest of a Green Party and clinging on to power. So, look, if the farmers are being demonised and being sacrificed as a sacrificial lamb, and I'm proud to come from a very mixed farm, and we grew everything and had cows, sheep, cattle, and a horse. I worked with the horse. But now if the horse is walking, you put a bag on him and he's, you know, where to stop him even breaking wind. It's so ridiculous and such a carry-on that you have. But what I see worse is we have an EPA, and I challenged you on this, Minister, I did before, and you didn't come back to me with the figures. They gave a clear bill of health to Tipperary there recently, county, lovely green map with all local authority plants and not emanating any wastewater into the rivers, untreated. That was downright, I can't use the word lie, but totally erroneous, false, disgusting. And when an agency of the state that's demonising and farmers and telling absolute, obviously the case, I can't use the word what I should use, everyone knows what it is. I have 30 in my own county. Brought officials recently, 10 of them arrived from Irish Water and County Council, and I look at my own plant in my own village. A big tank, just straight into the river, sure. And the EPA come taking a sample on the bridge 300 metres north of where the pollution is going into the river, belching in. And that's many towns and villages. So it's totally unfair the way you're demonising the farmers. It's actually destroying their confidence, because you're going to take out 20% of the land now by 2030 and and up to 80% by 2050. So you're tying their hands behind their back, you're spancing them, you're blindfolding them, and next thing you'll stop them from having a sense of smell. And what we have, no food, and no food security, and we won't be able to send the food we do abroad all over the world, all over Europe and all over the world. But the victimisation and the demonisation of farm and farm families is nothing short of scandalous by your government, by your party, by the NGOs here. But to have an official wing of the state telling porkies false reports, false, fake reports, and to get away with it. It's a shocking indictment on the corrupt state of this country that they can do that on a weekly basis and be challenged and go unnoticed. And then you have the soldiers of destiny in Antashka who don't want anyone to do anything. They stopped the plant in Kilkenny, the cheese plant, for nearly 3 or 4 years and wouldn't allow it to go ahead, brought it all the course in the land. Until the chief said here one day in reply to me that they were wrong to be doing this. And they're objecting to this, that and the other thing. And they have no objection to the big industrial plants going up or the data centres or anything else. But I stand here as a proud farmer's family's son. I have some land as well, now that I inherited from my ancestral home. But I want to support the farmers. You've abandoned them. But please don't drive them to the ground altogether. And please allow them to live and grow the food. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, I'm going to give you a caption from my Auntie Eileen's day-to-day diary from 1936. And one of the captions that I saw there recently on it was, P gone to the creamery. P was my father. Ned Barry called with the paper. Me and Cathy reading the paper. Ned Barry gone out to help in the yard. Then I look at, and I'm involved an awful lot within the vintage circles, and recently I was taking stuff out of a loft with the horse-drawn machine and all these machinery that the people used many, many years ago in farming, including for the drainage of lands, which they broke their backs with no machinery to drain land on the advice of government of how to stock their land. And then I was actually listening on television there a minute ago because I was in a housing committee, the Planning and Development Bill, and I heard Jennifer Whitmore say that she found it very hard to listen to the opposition as she was studying this since she was 18 years of age. And she found it very hard to listen to the independents, and she very hard to listen to Sinn Féin. Well, try Jennifer Whitmore very hard in digging a drain across a field and trying to get water off of it. Studying something all your life and living something all your life are two different things. And I find it very hard to listen to somebody like that when they have no experience in real life of what it means. We have listened to governments year on year, decade by decade, telling us under regulations how to farm the land and how to stock the land. 2011, Simon Coveney told people in this country, invest in white gold and milk, build your stocks, that's what the market wants. In 2023, they say we want to reduce the herd. This is what's happening. Every time there's a change of government, there's a change of policies. Every time the Green Party get into a government position, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael run with them, and what they do, penalise the farmers that they're told to go in one direction and now tomorrow go in another. What about the future of food security in Ireland? Then farmers come to you about saying, right, under the Slurry Act, we're not allowed to spread slurry at certain times of the year. Next thing it was brought to your attention about biodigesters. Éamon Ryan won't listen to biodigester. Why? Because it means that all the slurry that comes off of the farms, all the chicken litter that comes off, grass that can come off a land that doesn't have any animals on it, can actually be returned back in to producing power. But he won't listen to it, and it means that you don't have to cull any animal in this country. Again, the science is there, but you won't listen to science, but you're going off on different things that actually punish farmers that are trying to put food on your table. Advice from different governments telling them to go one way, and then the day after telling them to go the other way. So there's no future in farming in this country while we have governments that change regulation at every turn. We look at the vote that was taken, 329 votes for, 275 against. And every MEP that we sent out of here, bar 2, voted for this and 2 voted against it. But they've been voting for this every time. Those 2 people Sinn Féin had a representative out there, Chris McManus and Ming Flanagan. They've been voting with it all along. Come the last vote, they changed their vote because they thought it wasn't populistic for them to do so. They're not the people we want out there representing Ireland. We want real people. And when the European elections come around now, and the likes of the Fianna Fáil and the Fine Gael candidates are running now, every farmer should look up now to see that they've been sold out by their own. And there'll be independents running for the European elections that will represent you a lot better than the parties that have put you in this hole in the first place. And now they're being led by the Green Party, and every decision they make is being led by that. But the Green Party don't listen to science, and now Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are as guilty as the Green Party. And remember, come the European elections, independent Ireland will have candidates running. Just make sure you don't vote for the same people that have destroyed your future. Thank you.
10 minutes.
Cahill, I suppose I should start by saying I come from a farming background myself, and I believe that the people who are doing the greatest disservice to Irish agriculture are people like the last deputy we heard from, who pretends that holding out against the change that we need to make in this country and in our agriculture and in all our dimensions of our lives is something that will make it easier, that the holdouts will win the day by resisting to the very last ditch defence of untenable practices, that we will provide a future for Irish agriculture or for Irish rural Ireland. That is a totally blind alley. Every sector, regardless of what the sector is, will have to have sustainability at the heart of a long-term strategy for prosperity. The future for prosperous Irish farms lies in having sustainable methods of production. And that does mean changing some of the ways in which we have farmed in the past. And those who pretend that you can resist that and stick your head in the sand, they are leading those who they purport to represent into a blind alley. And I think that is something that really needs to be emphasised here, because I know as much as anyone who comes from rural Ireland that we need to be sustainable. We need to respect nature that provides the goods that we all enjoy. We need to recognise that present practices globally are extracting 3 times what nature can restore every year. So we are running into deficit in the way we treat some of our assets, and we need to correct that. But correcting that doesn't mean abandoning food production or abandoning the reputation we have. It means enhancing the reputation we have for good food, because we can verify that it comes from sustainable practices, that we are not polluting our rivers, that we're restoring rivers to pristine nature. And farmers know better than any what it is to manage land in a sustainable way. They have husbanded our land for years, and they know how to do this. But of course, we have to ensure that they are incentivised and supported to do that. And I think many people looking at the future of family farming don't see in sufficiently vivid colours what a prosperous family farm will look like in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time. And I think there's a strong onus on government to help to portray that. And I think not enough has been done to show that how it's been done. It can be done. We need to go beyond the common agricultural policy and develop new approaches. Imaginative and all as the common agricultural policy has been, it is not sufficient to drive that. And that's why I welcome that there will be a national nature restoration plan, where the Minister and his colleagues will spell out in detail the pathway that can bring us to these targets that have been established. I sat on the committee that heard from the Citizens' Assembly, and 60% of those who were on the Citizens' Assembly came from rural Ireland. Many of them were farmers, and they came with unanimous recommendations in most cases about the direction that we need to travel. I welcome the passage of the Nature Restoration Bill at EU level. I think important clarifications have emerged over the course of the debate. As I heard Seán Kelly emphasise recently, MEP, This is to be voluntary, it is to be incentivised, it has graduated targets, and it has the new emergency brake. This is something that will help farmers to adapt to what is a long-term sustainable future for their sector. And one thing that I also would say to you, Minister, and I've said it to you and your colleagues before, we are letting slip the need to have a sector-wide approach in food, in construction, and in all of the other key sectors. It is time that food is not making a sustainable supply chain in food is not all just about farmers and their production methods. It has to be also about the role of processors, the role of supermarkets, the role of many who waste food throughout the commercial and the non-commercial sector. It needs to be about how we change practices right along that supply chain so it can become sustainable. And it means the corollary of that is processors will pay more for produce that is farmed in a sustainable way compared to produce that are not. We haven't created that bigger tent under the heading of a circular economy strategy that could see us move to make sure that our food supply chain is of the very highest quality, and that right along that chain we're taking steps, not just at the farming end, but right along that chain we're taking steps to ensure that the way we manage that crucially important sector for rural Ireland in particular is to the very highest standard. And when we talk of origin green, that it is genuinely can stand up. I was disappointed to see that Sinn Féin seems to be now playing footsie with the approach that some have portrayed, that we can have our cake and eat it. Sinn Féin in the Biodiversity Committee were all for having a constitutional right to nature. But then they come in here and say, well, no, we don't want a restoration law, not yet. Make me virtuous, Lord, but not yet. The truth is, if we do not have a framework and a plan developed by the Minister and his colleagues, we won't deliver for Irish agriculture the approach that we need to have sustainable production. I would say to you, Minister, that your National Biodiversity Plan is a very significant step forward. I welcome its legal base. I welcome that you will now have a progress tracker and new indicators, and you will have better reporting. But I do think the targets are still vague. It is not entirely clear what the target is from one year to the next. They are much more about engagement with various processes and the direction of travel rather than reaching specific targets. Equally, I'm not convinced that we yet have the toolbox that is necessary to make the changes. And I can understand colleagues representing farming constituencies wanting to see some greater detail of the tools that will be available to drive some of the targets. But one of the big strengths of agriculture is in the whole climate debate is it is in the unique position of being able to not just reduce its carbon, but also sequester carbon through good practices. It can be a very significant earner in the future for agriculture. But we need to develop those processes that allows the position now to be benchmark and people to earn rewards for delivering that change. I think that presents statistical problems that you need to put your mind to and get people to work on. I think in terms of reporting to this House, we still have not met the central ask of the climate, rather the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity. We still don't have the central driver of how this is to be done and how within the Oireachtas it will be overseen. And I think we do need to think more about that process. One minister acting on his own, trying to push other ministers to do it is not sufficient. That's why I do see the merit in bringing a lot of our efforts, be it circular economy, biodiversity, under the umbrella of the approach that's taken to the climate plan, because they are interlocking challenges that we face. And having strategies overseen from the Taoiseach's office gives much more momentum, much more focus, and makes people much more responsible. The other element I think that needs to be looked at carefully is the whole issue of enforcement. It's all very well to have good laws, but the Citizens' Assembly were quite critical of our capacity to enforce our existing laws. So, Minister, I'd like to congratulate you on the work you are doing. I think we will watch with interest your development of the National Nature Restoration Plan, which follows from the passage of that legislation in Europe. I think that will be a really important opportunity to start to shape for people the pathway and to prove to deputies like Deputy O'Donoghue, who was speaking before me, that a credible pathway to prosperous farming is what you are offering, so that we can have nature conservation, we can have sustainable food production, and we can have prosperous farming working hand in hand. The time for this phony war of pitching one against the other and pretending that the government and many of the other parties in the opposition are selling farmers down the river it is leading us in the wrong direction. We will not resolve the challenges that face Irish agriculture if it becomes that sort of a Punch and Judy type of debate, which will those who will lose out most from that sort of direction will be the farming and rural communities themselves.
Thank you, Deputy. We now move to the independent group, starting with Deputy Michael Fitzmaurice, sharing with Deputy Catherine Connolly. 5 minutes.
Ramagot, and I welcome the opportunity of speaking on this. First of all, I think a few things need to be addressed. I heard reference earlier on to scaremongering. I hope it wasn't towards me, because I was to the forefront of highlighting difficulties on this nature restoration law. And I wouldn't like, I've dealt with the national parks and indeed the department for many years, and I wouldn't like anybody thinking, because we got legal advice on it, and I think that needs to be stated. I heard reference to the Citizens' Assembly there earlier. The facts are that there was 6 people from farming background on it, because I asked the question and I wasn't being told how many of them were active farmers. On top of that, some people say that we're doing a disservice to farmers. Some farmers might be in here talking that might be ranchers with a few hundred acres in the eastern parts of the country. What I'm talking about is small farmers in the west of Ireland. 70% of them are gone organic, and they wouldn't have the quality of land that have actually peaty soil land, because anyone that knows this directive would know that it doesn't affect top quality mineral soil land, good quality land. It's affecting the peaty soil land. I remember, and unfortunately I'm old enough to remember the Habitats Directive, and I remember our now President Michael D. Higgins telling everyone, look at lads, you have nothing to worry about. This won't affect you whatsoever when designations come in, SACs, and I have 12 of them in a 20-kilometre area around me. That's the facts. I know a fair bit about them. And I remember being told there wasn't a problem. You won't be anything to do with farming, nothing like that. And the lads, this cut and turf, don't worry about it. I saw in 2011 helicopters flying over us. I also saw the Gardaí up and down the roads looking to see what were people doing. That's a fair change from being told in 1997. And with the best will in the world, ministers, and I'm not having a go at any minister, they believe what they see in front of them. But the problem is that down the road, and we've seen it in the Habitats Directive, to wasn't what was brought in. It was the ECJ judgments that came in after that, that tightened us into basically a straitjacket. And now we see, for a farmer, if they have to go ploughing their land, if they're on a designated area, if they want to go putting fertiliser, actually if you want to put cattle out in it, if you want to go by the so-called law, you're supposed to turn around and get consent. In the line of the nature restoration law, the problem is, and this is coming from legal people, this isn't me saying it, that by default under Article 4.1 and 4.2, that you will be, all peat soils is claimed now as basically not in good status. On top of that, the worry is there down the line. Right, I know, and I've said it publicly, so that no one say I'm scaremongering, I said the state have enough of ground to cover it in 2030, because Bordnamona and Quilcha And if you look at the wording of the directive of the nature restoration law, it states very clearly that any works finished, carried out already, cannot be included. It has to be either ongoing works or new works. That's the facts. So when you add what the 19,000 hectares the Board of Mona have done, yes, they will be able to do some, and it will cover us in 2030. I've said that openly, and Quilcha have land as well that will cover us. But it's from then on. And tell me a place in this country that the state own agricultural drained peatland. That is land that has been shored. There was bog was cut away in it years ago. It was shored. There's green grass growing in it, and now farmers are farming it. And the reason that was done, the same EU gave them grants to do it. The reason that was done was to basically make small farmers that had the 30, 40, 50 acres in the west, the northwest, down as far as West Cork, out in parts of Kerry, out in the Midlands, to make them more viable, to be able to basically earn a living and rear a family on it, and that's what they have done for years. And in my opinion, and yeah, like people talk about acres in here. Acres has nothing got to do with the nature restoration law. Whoever believes it has. It's an environmental scheme, yes, and we had 46,000, and we welcome what the Minister done this morning. 9,000 is 55. We must remember that under the old REP scheme we had 70,000, and we're shouting now about having 54 or 5,000 farmers in it. I believe that it is now in the hands, there's no point in we cotton ourselves, it is in the hands of the MPWS to now draw up a plan. That plan is to go to Europe within 2 years, and all I can say to you, Minister, is that I hope that you deal with the stakeholders. There's a worrying part to this, because if you look at the designated areas, in the wording of it, it talks about they being prioritised to be basically getting the double bubble of stopping. And at the moment, have a look at Lough Finchna. In 1997, under the Habitats Directive, was it ever envisaged that the likes of Lough Finchna, the people would be let basically flood their houses before the Habitats Directive would come in? And it's a major, major problem. Thank you.
In the time I have, I'll try to be as focused as possible. And I welcome the speech today, Minister, and I welcome that you've confirmed that the Government is confident, just as Deputy Fitzmaurice has said, that the re-wetting targets, and you say, they're confident that the 2030 and the 2040 re-wetting targets at a minimum can be met entirely on state lands. I welcome that. I welcome the clarification that flooding is not in question. It has nothing to do with flooding. I welcome the clarification that there are no designation under the nature restoration law. No designations there. I welcome the fact that it's confirmed for the record that all of this is voluntary. And I thank you for that. I want to thank my office for the work and also the library for the digest as usual. And I will not be party to anything that seeks to reduce the local farmers' ability, particularly the small farmers, to live in the area and to farm sustainably. And if I have a chance, I'll come to some of the very good projects that are going at the moment. I'd like to pay tribute to Deputy Mick Wallace, who comes from a small farm and who's gone out on a limb in Europe in relation to this, with the assistance from Deputy Claire Daly. And I think it's important to put it on the record. It's nearly 5 years since we declared a climate and a biodiversity emergency. I sat on a council that had a draft biodiversity plan, a draft one for donkey's years, and no biodiversity officer. Your department was starved of funds, starved of leadership from governments and so on. I've said that on the record. And today we stand up on this, and as well as that, in relation to this scheme, there's an emergency break as well, in addition to be voluntary. It's very important that the message goes out around it. Globally, natural areas are under severe pressure due to human activity, and it's worsened by climate breakdown. This is almost 5 years after we declared an emergency, led by the people of Ireland and the children of Ireland. I haven't time to go into the statistics. We all know them. They're on the record. But what's important to say that nature is in dire straits and requires immediate, large-scale intervention to avert extensive species extinction. I mean, the hen harriers have been mentioned as an iconic bird and so on. There's a huge amount of of deterioration here, despite all of the conventions and despite all the targets set. And the EPA, in their wisdom, looked at what was driving the loss of Irish habitat species and natural spaces, and they listed out agricultural activity, alien and invasive species, conversion of vegetated land to built land, extraction of resources and forestry. What they left out completely was government policy and EU policy that have turned farming on its head over the years. I mean, the most daft policy was intervention, overproduction, if anything encapsulated the tautology of the European policy, it was intervention. That's not mentioned at all by the EPA. Neither is the elephant in the room, which is war and ongoing war. And whatever changes we try to make to stop climate change, war has to be stopped, because we can't have the two parallel things that don't go together. Earlier on, the senior minister talked about the tears in his eyes when he saw the trawlers when he was down off Inishboffin. I agree with him totally. However, the very good policy to stop the sprat being taken out in an unsustainable manner and measures is still going on unabated because of the foolishness of the government in relation to the consultation process they carried out. So again, it's 6 years later, they're still taking sprat out without any oversight and no policy in being. The European Bank, that bastion of socialism, I say tongue-in-cheek, they tell us when ecosystems are degraded, they stop providing those services so nature restoration can be seen as an economic investment that yields a return. They tell us that for every euro invested in nature restoration, this adds 8 to 38 euros in benefits to the society. This is the European Central Bank telling us this. The view, humanity needs nature to survive. And so in the economy, so do the economy and the banks. The more species become extinct, the less diverse our ecosystems, and this presents a growing financial risk. You know, I say tongue-in-cheek, that bastion of socialism, because all of those institutions, including the EU, pushed unsustainable farming, unsustainable living, and now the penny is dropping when we're on the verge of, is it the 6th extinction? That's what it takes. A bit like the war in Gaza to get some action. It takes 30,000 people. I'm going to finish up just by mentioning some of the very good schemes. And again, I want to thank the Digest, and I'm sure the Minister is very familiar with them. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 laid out. But I want to just finish on the Donu Farming Group, which had the project was set up to control and trial plots in the Midlands to develop clear workable guidelines for a transition programme to biological farming. And there's a small group, a Meath there, of 12 Donu farmers. It's interesting, the word Donu, that comes from a female goddess of nature. And you know, I just finish on Bonu. Bonu is actually what's happening in rural areas, the depopulation of the Gaeltacht areas and the rural areas. So while it's fantastic to have Donu, at the moment we have Bonu, so we need to look at the two. I'm fully behind you, Minister, in relation to this, and would like to work with you.
Thank you, Deputy. Some leeway, Minister, who have 10 minutes to finish up.
First of all, I'll try and sum up in the 10 minutes I have a lot of the points. Again, I want to thank all the deputies for their contributions. It's somewhat disappointing that the main opposition spokespeople for agriculture and for the environment have all left. We often get criticised in this chamber for not having the ministers present in Dáil debates, and it is disappointing that they didn't choose to stay for the remainder of the debate. Just in the comments made by Deputy O'Rourke, and by the Sinn Féin deputies generally, I still am at odds as to understand why they took the position they did in the Parliament in January. Deputy O'Rourke has raised issues around the concrete funding measures. We have the funding for that. Without a roadmap, the roadmap will be our nature restoration plan. I agree wholeheartedly in terms of the Citizens' Assembly, both assemblies, the one I established and the main assembly, the Young People's Assembly, about the historic underfunding of nature, and we are in the process of trying to redress that, and I do hope that if Sinn Féin are on this side of the House in the next government, that they will continue that trajectory, because it needs to be continued. The local authority biodiversity officers, the skills, we've done all that. The peer-to-peer supports, that's in process and train as well. the state is leading the way, and certainly a lot of the points made I certainly could have given the speech that Deputy O'Rourke made, but the inconsistency here is quite staggering. So in relation specifically to the points raised by Deputy Kerrane around their MEP Chris McManus, and we've had no engagement from the MEP on this. Our door has been open to all MEPs. We've spoken to them all. I couldn't find anything in the amendment around compensation. I don't know where it is, so maybe they might come back to me on that. And again, I think in terms of the multi-annual framework, financial framework, Seán Kelly has been on the record as stating that there will be support there, hopefully in the next, but there already is funding from Europe through the LIFE programmes, through the EIPs. I looked at the Sinn Féin budget for the nature restoration, 75 million. We actually announced more than that this week alone, with 2 EIPs, a LIFE project, and the expansion of the acres. So again, just inconsistency. It's disappointing. Deputy Carthy raised issues around targets being accompanied by a plan. Yes, that's exactly what we're doing. The implementation of the plan could fall, again, I'd say it could fall on your watch if you're in the fortunate position to be in government next time round. And again, we're setting this up, and I do hope that Sinn Féin will follow it through. Thank Deputy Nash for his contributions and for the support of their sister party on the NRL Europe. Again, to thank the European People's Party, but also I think Deputy Connolly raised the support by Deputy Mick Wallace and Deputy Claire Daly, and had really good engagement with them, and I really want to thank them for their support as well. Deputy Cahill raised issues around the capital value of land and participation in schemes, the hen harrier designation. Again, I acknowledge all of this, and he's correct. He's not incorrect in terms of the unsustainability of big countries like Brazil and China. He's also mentioned the issues around land adjacent to rewetting lands or rewetting projects. Again, I go back to points made last year by Pat O'Toole in the Farmers' Journal about demonstration farms. I think that's going to be hugely important. I think Michael Fitzmaurice and I spoke about that as well. And again, to look at the opportunities around this, around in terms of rural tourism and food produced, wholesome food produced close to nature. Deputy Whitmore, I agree in terms of baby steps. It is baby steps in terms of what we've done, but that 65 million represents a 135% increase in funding to the National Parks and Wildlife Service. It's still not enough, and that trajectory will need to continue. I agree with her on the remit of Borden and Cuív. We want Cuív to go much further, particularly in relation to the hen harrier, and to strengthen their commitments in relation to the hen harrier threat response plan. Cuív in the National Biodiversity Action Plan have committed to managing 30% of their estate for nature by 2025. So again, that commitment is there, but we do want them to go further, and I do agree with her in relation to the remit of Borden and Cuív. That does need to change in line with what we're expecting of them and in terms of restoring nature. And I do hope that through the public consultation for the hen harrier threat response plan, we will see actions emerging that will turn around the fortunes of this really iconic bird. Deputy Cahill, again, I thank you for your comments as well in relation to the 4th NBAP, tackling wildlife crime, invasive alien species. We're certainly making significant progress in terms of wildlife crime. And again, welcome the supporting comments around. I saw Deputy Cahill watch with great interest at and enthralled by Seán Ronan's film of birdsong in the AV room. It was lovely actually to step in the room away from the madness of this place and just watch birds and listen to birdsong. And again, thank Deputy Cathasaigh for bringing Seán and his team to the AV room. And he's right, many are already restoring nature, many communities, tidy towns groups, many landowners are already restoring nature. I want to thank David and Roisin Fay and their children, Michael and Marie. I have the Westmead mud on my boots to prove it, that I was there this morning with my colleagues, Minister McConlogue and Minister Hackett. They turned around poor water quality status to good water by simple measures with a number of participating landowners, by putting in wider buffer zones and putting in solar panels and pumps to give water to their animals, and has turned around the bathing water status of the lake there up around Lilliput, and again commend them. And it's for their children that we're doing this. It's for you know, I would love to see them having that same future on the land that their parents have had. Again, Deputy Paul Murphy made some really valid points in relation to our special areas of conservation, or SACs. In fact, all of our SACs have site-specific conservation objectives. There's activities requiring consent in relation to those, and again, hundreds of measures across over 600 sites across the country. I want to focus a little bit on the points made by Deputy Cuív around nature restoration and versus rewilding. I'm not entirely sure what rewilding is, but I do know that restoration is an active engagement. It does involve active participation. We need landowners, we need farmers, we need grazing animals. I kind of sometimes see rewilding as a bit of an abandonment of land, and there's too much of that happening due to the succession and the challenges around farmers not having young people coming forward. So again, I agree with that point around the reference. What are we talking about? We do need active farmers and active farming. And again, the corncrake projects up around Northwest Donegal and Mayo are starting to yield success. And I want to thank all of the Corncrake Life team who are working with landowners. I've been up with them, and I'm going back up there again in a few weeks to see some of the work that's going on. It's wonderful to start hearing the sound of the corncrake, the cracks on the landscape again. Again, thank Deputy Cathasaigh for his really always poetic comments that he brings to the table. Deputy Marc, who raised the issue of Sellafield, I'll engage with them in that outside of this chamber. And Deputy Mattie McGrath, typical Deputy McGrath, if Deputy McGrath has land, maybe he'd like to get involved in restoring some nature. There's going to be good money in it, so I would like him to invite him to get involved in some restoration projects. I agree wholeheartedly with Deputy Bruton as well in relation to farmers and looking at that sector-wide approach. I think that's hugely significant, and take on board the points around vague targets and the NBAP. And again, thank both Deputy Fitzmaurice and Deputy Connolly for their contributions. Cahill, it has been a useful debate. I hope deputies found it useful. We will continue to engage. I am conscious that this debate will go into the records of the Dáil, and it maybe in the future it will be examined by researchers or of academics. They will either do so in the context of our collective failure to restore nature, to save species from extinction, failure to save our corncrakes, our hen harriers and our curlews, or our lapwing, or they may be here researching in the future the transcript in light of examining the turning point for nature in Ireland and Europe, where our skies again are full of birds, our hedgerows are buzzing with pollinators and our farmland birds, our seas are teeming, our towns and cities are climate resilient, and our collective well-being is made all the better for the sights, the sounds and the smells of a nature-positive future. Again, I thank all the deputies for the contributions, and we look forward to continuing to engage for the lifetime of this government, and hopefully, please God, whoever's here in this seat in the future will continue to do the work that we have been doing.
Thank you, Minister. And that concludes the statements on the nature restoration law.